So I hope you're sitting comfortably. So we're going to dive in. And like I said, this is going to be a long video with very little thrills in terms of editing and so on. However, we're going to go deep into MEDDPICC. So first of all, a little while ago, I produced a MEDDPICC playbook, which is what I'm going to use for the backbone of this training. And if you want access to that MEDDPICC playbook and you don't already have access, then just ping me a DM, or I might even put a link in the comments or in the bio that you can click on and get access to it. But first of all, when we think about like MEDDPICC, I always think about two things. I think one, like it's a fantastic tool for qualifying your deals and your opportunities, for making sure that you know what information you've got, what's missing, and what you have to do. But I think there's two kind of common mistakes that get made with MEDDPICC that I always try and address whenever I coach it. The first one is it's very kind of seller centric, right? A lot of it's about us. Whereas what we really want to be thinking about is things through the lens of the customer. So we want to try and almost flip MEDDPICC round so that it's not so much about what do we need, what information have we got, but it's like, where's the customer on their journey? What's important to them? And how does getting to each one of these bits of information help them make an informed purchasing decision that's going to, relieve pain, create value, make them feel better, make them more money, save them time, whatever it might be. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it's a great acronym because it's kind of easy to remember, right? But it's not in the order that you use it. That's the kind of very obvious thing. So there's two things we're going to focus on initially. First of all is turning it around so that it's a customer-centric operating model. Secondly, and kind of more importantly, starting with pain. So whenever we're looking for an opportunity, whether it's prospecting, whether it's discovery, as we go through an opportunity and trying to add different stakeholders, different decision makers in, we're always looking for pain. What's the pain that we're solving? What's the pain we're solving for this individual, whether they're a user of the solution, whether they're a manager of the user of the solution, or whether they are an executive, or whether they're the economic buyer. We have to figure out how are we solving a problem. So that starts with identifying the pain. So the I, when I use MEDDPICC, actually has three different meanings. First of all, it's identify. So particularly in that prospecting and that discovery stage, it's how do we identify the problem and what its root cause is. Second is implicate. So once we've identified it, we need to make sure that the client sees it as well. So implicate's about, pointing towards it, making it clear, making it obvious. So you've got to make sure that the customer's on the same page with you, that they see the pain, that it's important to them, that it is painful enough that it warrants a conversation, that it warrants further discussion. And then finally, irritate the pain. So, and this is typically when you've been working on an opportunity a little time, and maybe you're into the nitty gritty of some kind of features and benefits or decision criteria, and things tend to go, I think it gets hard, right? So opportunities are, even buyers find it hard to get these things over the line. That's when you need to irritate the pain to create urgency and to create action, and quantify it as much as possible so that that irritation, that annoyance has a number or a metric against it. So kind of they all link together. But number one, most important thing, start with pain. So I'm going to get off my sermon now a little bit about pain, but that's the first thing I'd always say, start with pain. So when we think about the journey a buyer goes on, this is a sort of B2B buying cycle that was created by Neil Rackham, who's the guy who wrote Spin Selling and Major Account Sales Strategy, both great books, both still really valid despite their age. You just need to update some of the technologies and some of the kind of the how within them. But this is his view of a customer buying cycle, the cycle the customer goes through. But I've just changed the names of each stage a little bit, and I've aligned them with the terms that Gartner uses. So, you should all be familiar with Gartner. They have a massive presence in the IT consulting space. If you're dealing with any kind of CEO or any kind of organization, even if they're not a Gartner customer, they will certainly be reading Gartner white papers. They'll certainly be on the list of target customers for Gartner reps, and they'll be aware of how Gartner break down typically kind of the buying journey. So 5 kind of fundamental stages. The first is problem identification. So that's back to the pain. That's about how you find the pain and creating urgency or creating or warranting action, right? Creating enough pain that it warrants action. Solution exploration. So this is really about understanding, right, what solutions are out there, what are the criteria that's going to be important to us, what are we going to need before making a decision. Addressing concerns. This is really about buyer certainty. So I don't need to tell you, you get ghosted towards the end of any kind of sales cycle. And that typically comes from a couple of different reasons. One might be you haven't created enough urgency. One might be that they've got other things going on, so it isn't that urgent, or it's not, they're not ready yet. But the other part happens a lot is the risk, the professional risk, the personal risk that buyers take when implementing a solution, particularly if it's a higher value solution. They need to make sure they're getting it right. They're looking for certainty and addressing concerns. This is about trying to alleviate that and give them confidence they're making a good buying decision. Supplier selection. So this is the transactional part, right? This is where you actually put pen to paper. This is when you get terms signed, you get financials agreed, and you go through that technical process of making a purchase and becoming a supplier or a vendor, whatever it might be. And then solution ownership. And this is kind of the most important part to the customer. We tend to forget about it because we've got, signed DocuSign or whatever, we're running around celebrating we've got commission. But the customer needs to see the value. They need to experience the value that's been promised during the sales process. All right. So that is the most important part for them. So if you look at how this maps to MEDDPICC, there's and what you'll see is, as we go through this, is that the acronyms kind of crop up again and again and again. So, like I said, always start with pain, but pain crops up in, I'd say, like every stage of the sales process, whether it's the identify the pain here, whether it's the implicate the pain as part of the solution exploration, whether it's the irritate the pain, so that's a lot about the cost of inaction to get them moving, or whether it's about, and I know it's not an I, it's an E, but it's a it word, eliminate the pain. I think it's really important that actually, we are checking that the pain has gone, like a good doctor or a surgeon would do. Once you've completed the operation, you go back and check with your patient. Are you feeling better? Are you able to walk on that hip? Has the rash cleared up? I mean, but it's the fact that the pain has been eliminated, the value has been delivered, and we've fulfilled our promise as sellers to our customers. So pain sits all the way through this. Metrics, again, come up all the way through it as well. So I almost think you can't go, you can't have, you can't have pain or implicate the pain. You can't have pain without metrics. Sometimes you can, and that's because often metrics are like really hard to get. So sometimes you'll be engaging with a buyer who doesn't necessarily understand their metrics. They have a vague understanding of them. I was actually talking to a CRO the other day, and we were having a conversation about some key ratios. He was really focused on 4 or 5 ones. I asked about a couple of other ones that weren't necessarily on his dashboard, and he kicked himself because he said he should have known them, right? But those weren't front of mind to him, despite the fact that they were quite important, but he was aware that he was off them. They weren't where he wanted them to be. So sometimes getting to metrics can be hard, just to getting to kind of detail. But so you normally don't get pain without metrics, but you definitely don't get metrics without pain, because metrics is about quantifying that pain. And then as you look at how the pain and the metrics map together in that initial part of the sales cycle, the sales process, it's very much about identifying the pain. So there is a typical industry problem that we're trying to solve, and metrics are kind of generic industrial ones. So, and this is where like case studies come in really handy, because we can talk about other customers who've been through this problem and the kind of the metrics around their solution, kind of what it was costing them, what they've saved, etc., etc. So these are kind of more general industry metrics. But then as we move on to implicating the pain, like we need to take another step on the metric journey. So think about metrics as a kind of almost like a pyramid. They're quite broad and generic initially at this kind of industry stage, but then as we get further into the sales conversation, they kind of narrow down and focus on the company. So you might go from talking about a case study or some general industry trends to talking about specific KPIs that exist within that business. Again, so I sell to sales leaders, so it might be about close rates, it might be about average order value, it could be a range of different things. But that metric is getting gradually more specific as we progress through the buyer journey. So again, if you put yourself in the mind of the buyer, it's like, oh, I know there is a broad problem in what I do around this thing. That's kind of problem identification, solution exploration. Oh, okay, I can start to quantify, I can measure and weigh the issue that I've got at hand. I can see my internal metric. Okay, so I've got that. I need to get my close ratios, up. I need to get my average order value up. I need to get my sales cycle down, whatever it might be. And then when you go on to addressing concerns, this is when that metric needs to become even more focused, right? So you need to go from a KPI to a business case metric that would stack up when put in front of the economic buyer. So instead of it being just, right, we're going to, my close ratio needs to go from, I don't know, X% to Y%, needs to increase from, 20 to 30%. This is where you go, actually, what does that mean? So on the average quarter, an increase from 20 to 30% in close ratio means that we deliver an extra X 100,000 in revenue and Y 100,000 in profit. And if you track that back the last kind of 6 quarters, for example, you'll see that this means blah, blah, blah. So you go through that process of creating business case metrics that an economic buyer will value, will look at as part of a buying submission and sign off and be happy with. So these things come in pairs, right? Pain and metrics come in pairs. And as you get further into the journey, it's about getting those metrics more and more specific, more and more measurable, more and more trustworthy. Because like at this level, talking about ROI and things like that, yeah, I think they've got ROI fatigue in the world. Anything too specific tends to be taken with a pinch of salt. But once you get to this level and you've gone through that proper discovery process and really understood your customers, challenges and the kind of knock-on effects, you can get to the metrics that are having a real impact on the business, that are really hurting it, and you can build the business case around that. So it's this kind of funneling process going down from these generic pain points that you can identify all the way down to really specific ones. So as we come back to this first stage in the buying process, we think about the other bits of information you need to get out. And so this is kind of a very early, this is prospecting / discovery, I'd say. It's kind of that kind of point. So it's it's listening for a problem, understanding how you might be able to help it, and then who might be involved. Now, typically in MEDDPICC, I include 3Ds. Why is that? So decision process is obviously really important. Understanding that how a decision gets made. We'll come back and go into that detail. Decision criteria, again, what are the kind of factors you're going to use to make your decision? Again, really important. But one of the things that most often than not MEDDPICC doesn't kind of capture is like, who is everybody involved in the decision? And in the MEDDPICC framework, we have the economic buyer, so that gets talked about. We have the champion, pardon me. We have the champion, which gets talked about a lot, and a lot of people say if you don't have a champion, you don't have a deal. But the kind of other decision makers who might sit in this process don't get talked about that much. And if you think that, I think the latest Gartner stats or Challenger stats, something like that, might be 11.2 people per decision. If you've got an economic buyer and you've got a champion, and you don't always get to speak to the economic buyer, right? If you've got a champion, it might be, okay, do I have 2 or 3 people? That's maybe 30% of the people that are going to be making, maybe less than 30% of the people that are going to be making the decision. I need to understand who these individuals are. And again, for each one of these individuals, what's their pain? Okay, so this is why pain keeps coming back, and this is why it's important. And this is why we always start with pain, because every time we identify somebody new as part of that decision-making unit, we've got to think, right, what is their pain point? What is important to them? And I'm going to touch on pain and how you can think about pain and different persona types of pain next. So this is what I call the Whiffam matrix, or the what's in it for me matrix. And it's kind of a blend of 2 different sales methodologies kind of pushed together to try and help identify kind of pains, problem areas for different types of users, different types of personas within a sales process. So fundamentally speaking, there's really, and some people talk about it in terms of being 4 or 5. I try and bucket into 3 because I like 3s. There's kind of 3 reasons people buy in B2B. In B2C, they'll talk about health, wealth, and relationships. In B2B, talk about time, money, and status. So time, help me do a task quicker, give me time back to focus on something else, something where I'm better equipped, or I'd rather be, I can enjoy myself more, whatever it might be. So give me time back. Money is, there's 2 sides to the money coin. It's like, help me make more money, or help reduce how much money I'm spending. So it's like top line, bottom line. And then status, again, there's 2 sides to that coin as well. It's help me feel good about myself. So am I doing something, have I got a good work-life balance? Do I feel like I'm working for an organization that has the planet's best interests at heart? Is it aligned with my ethical values? Do I like the people that I work with? Do I have the tools to do the job that makes me happy? All those kind of things, that internal side. And the external piece is, how do I look to others? How do my peers think about me? How does my boss think about me? I'm going to get that job. How does my customer think about me? Does my customer think I'm a swell guy or gal, and they would like to buy something from me? So those are the 3 things to think about from a why buy, the kind of the problem you're solving. You're giving them time back, you're putting more money in their pocket, or you're making them look good or feel good, right? Boil it down really very simple. And then Miller Hyman talk a lot about the different kind of, I don't think they call them persona buckets, but that's kind of what I tend to call them. First being the end user. So this is the person who's going to be using your product or service. So that might be, I don't know, if you're selling Salesforce, that might be a salesperson. The line manager is the person who's not necessarily going to be using it firsthand, but they manage a team of individuals that use it. So, sales manager, Salesforce. Exec, so you could think about this in this analogy as a CRO. And then technical buyer, you might think about this as somebody from IT or somebody from security, thinking about, okay, does it integrate with the laptops that we have, the software that we run, does it meet the security requirements? It's just 4 different types. And then like the economic buyer, sometimes they're the exec, or sometimes that's like a fifth thing as well. But I kind of tend to leave it out for the sake of this because we spend a lot of time thinking about economic buyers a bit further on. So when we're thinking about pain, when we're thinking about identifying pain, implicating pain, irritating pain, particularly identifying the pain, a tool like this can be really helpful because this is where we do kind of some hypothesizing. So if our solution makes it quicker for people to do their Salesforce updates because it's some kind of Salesforce plugin, then we're giving them time back. So we can think about, right, saving your sellers time so they can spend more time in front of customers, which is going to put more money in front of their pockets. It's going to make them feel good about themselves because they can buy better cars or get promoted quicker from mid-market to enterprise, or from a seller to a manager. Then think about the line manager as well, that when they're coming to forecasts, right, it puts time back so they can be more accurate about their forecasting. They can quickly identify or better identify where they need to do more coaching, so that helps win rate, put money in their pocket, look good in front of their boss, and so on. Hopefully you get the theme here. And then from an executive perspective, so they can see they get one single view of the whole of their organization, so they don't need to go back and look again. It's live, it's real time, one view, and it's done, right? That saves them time. It means they can make the strategic decisions they need to drive the top line growth of the organization, to get their bonus or earn out, whatever it might be. And again, they feel good about themselves. Their CEO or CRO or whatever thinks they're great, is more likely to promote them, move them, get them that sweet posting, in New York or whatever it might be. And then from the technical buyer, and this is where a lot of people get caught, right? This is where loads of people, particularly if you're selling IT services and IT solutions, this is where loads of people get caught, is because the technical buyer will have lots of questions. You assume that they're your champion. You assume that you're solving their problems. These individuals are literally there they are a safeguard. They're there to make sure that you are compliant. In what I do, oftentimes a technical buyer tends to be somebody from HR or talent management or sales enablement when I'm selling training and coaching, and they want to know, am I going to go bust in a week and therefore not be able to deliver once they've given me a chunk of change? They want to know, right, have you done this before in organizations such as ours, so that when we make this decision, we are on solid ground that you can integrate with us, whatever it might be. But these individuals will have a lot of questions, and you can get sucked into thinking they're a champion. They can only say yes. No. They can only say no. They're an important factor, and if they don't say yes, then or don't approve, then you're not going anywhere. But they are not. They're a gatekeeper rather than a decision maker. So it's very difficult, and you need to think about, how do I make it easy to engage with these individuals, to give them what they need so that they can do their job and move on quickly. Because if they've got to come back and forth and they start to get negative sentiments towards you or your solution, that can have a unwanted impact on your sale or your sales process. So I use a slightly extended version of MEDDPICC. In fact, I include 3 Ds and 2 Ps and 2 Cs. And I know there's various different flavors of MEDDPICC, but I do this for a quite deliberate reason, and I'll touch on it throughout the video. But really just to kind of give you a view, and this is my my playbook that I'll refer to throughout the video. And if you haven't got access to this, then I'll drop a link in the show notes. But basically, MEDDPICC. I think about it this way. So obviously you've got your metrics, which are standard, economic buyer, which is standard, and then you've got a couple of Ds. And typically you have the decision process, which is how your prospective client goes through their internal workings to get to a purchasing decision. And oftentimes that's very well defined. They might have a really rigorous buying journey, buying process, particularly if they're a larger organization or if they're heavy on process. You might need to be a registered supplier. There might have things like SAP, so on and so forth. So there'll be some technical aspects of that, but then also in that decision process, it'll be right. Who needs to see it? Who's involved in the decision for this particular opportunity, this particular buying scenario, and who are the people who just need to see paperwork, business cases, any kind of spend authorization? Who are the individuals that are going to need to see that as part of any buying process in the organization, in the business unit, in the team that you're in the country that you're in, whatever it might be. So decision process is it's quite a broad church. And while organizations sometimes have a really well-defined business process, decision-making process, oftentimes, they don't. They have a rough idea. Sometimes you'll be speaking to people who are not really sure how to get things signed off. Sometimes you'll be speaking to people who understand that, well, I know who has to sign off at the end, but the steps to get there, I need to figure out who else needs to be involved. And particularly as decision making or sort of purchasing decisions become more and more risky for organizations, so there's a lot of risk associated with making a buying decision. We've seen the number of individuals involved in that expand, which is why I have a separate category for decision making unit. And when I first started selling, MEDDPICC wasn't really something that we used. Obviously, it existed back in the early noughties, but it was very much in America, and it's very much kind of come in, I suppose, over the last 10, 15 years, particularly with the rise of SaaS. But we always used to think about decision-making units. So which individuals are involved in making this decision? And then when you think about who makes up your decision-making unit, you've got to think of a number of different types of people. There's the kind of obvious ones, right? There is the economic buyer, so they're going to be involved somewhere. There's going to be a budget owner. They may or may not be the economic buyer, but they'll be involved. Maybe procurement, maybe HR if it's to do with people, maybe a CFO, some kind of exec who runs the business or the line of business that this decision sits in. And then you might find that a manager is sponsoring this and they're trying to drive it for their team, and they might want to involve a couple of their team who they really trust, so like these kind of trusted lieutenant type characters who they want to bring in to make sure that decisions are being made both from the perspective of the people on the front line as well as what management might think. So this decision-making unit can spread anything from 2 or 3 people on relatively small tactical purchases to 10, 15, 20, 25 people. In fact, the biggest piece of business I've ever been involved with, the decision-making unit involved like 7 CIOs as a very starting point before you got into the financial decision makers, the VPs and execs who works into those CIOs who are trying to make things happen, people in operations. So it was a really sprawling, big organization, and I had so many people involved in making that decision that getting decisions through were quite painful. Now, typically in organizations of that size, they realize that and they figure out ways of streamlining it, they have processes and so on. But never underestimate the number of people involved in any decision and the number of people specifically who can say no. Okay, there's lots and lots of people that can say no in a buying situation, and a limited number that can actually say yes. So we'll come back and talk more about the decision-making unit as we go on, but I thought it was really important to highlight it. And if I have a couple of swigs from my tea as we go through the video, then I hope you'll forgive me. So decision-making process, that's the mechanics by which a decision gets made. Decision-making unit, that's the individuals that are involved. And again, you'll have individuals like the economic buyer, technical buyer who will come on and talk about procurement, etc., etc. And then the decision criteria. So these are those classic kind of questions whereby you're asking, your client to articulate to you, how are you going to make this decision? What are the important factors when it comes to making a decision about X or making a buying decision about Y or kind of spending any money? And things that typically crop up, particularly, price always gets thrown in here. And people might go to its price or cost or return on investment or, whatever it might be, capital out, CapEx or OpEx, depending on how they treat it or what you're selling. So decision criteria, they start with the obvious stuff, but they can get really kind of, intricate at times, and it's going to be different for every individual. So while there might be a consensus, so like everybody involved in I don't know, the 5 or 10 people that are making this decision, they might all think, well, we need good value for money, so the price needs to be a certain amount because we've only got a certain amount of budget. And they might all think, well, the data needs to be located in our sovereign territory, so the UK, US, Europe, whatever it might be. It might need these features, that features, but then there'll be almost like a Venn diagram of opinions, and some of them will overlap, and there'll be this core, maybe, I don't know, 50 to 80% of things that are all the same for everybody. But there will be, different individuals depending on their personality, their specific needs, their part in the organization, what they've seen before, their history. They might have different views on what's important. And like I said a minute ago, there's so many people that can say no. It's important to understand, of the people in the decision-making unit, what are their decision-making criteria, okay? Getting to that level of clarity is really going to help you out. Now, none of this is easy, and it takes time, and you have to think about how you ask the questions. I'm going to come on to all of that as we progress through the video. But for smaller deals, yes, there might be a specific set of decision criteria for that deal that doesn't, differ much. But as you get into kind of medium, enterprise, and specifically global, that decision criteria section can get really funky really quickly. And that's where you've got to do some work to actually narrow down, figure out what's important, and figure out what's important to the people who are important, right? So, placing your bets on the individuals that carry the most sway. And that's not always the execs. Sometimes you'll find that there are what Seth Godin refers to in his book as linchpins. So if you've ever read Linchpins, it's a really good book. I kind of highly recommend it. But you'll often find in businesses there are these 1 or 2 individuals who their influence, their authority, their importance to the organization are much, much greater than their job title would suggest. And particularly if you work in, if you sell into IT, as I did for many years, there'll be somebody who just really understands, where all the kind of bodies are buried. He or she will understand the network. They'll understand the on-prem servers that they can't move into the cloud. They'll understand how they did a cloud migration, or how they, moved from, a legacy software application through to some kind of SaaS solution, and the pains and problems that went through there, particularly migrating data and so on. So these individuals with this outsized amount of influence, and it's about finding who they are and what's going to be important to them. So decision criteria is not as simple as it looks, particularly when you start to drill into it. So the 3 Ds, then partner. So a lot of my professional history and a lot of the customers I work with are, they work with partners, whether that might be an organization that is a professional services firm for Salesforce, or for AWS, or Microsoft Azure, or Dynamics, whatever it might be. And their partners are the big tech software vendors that they need to engage with really well, that they get a lot of their lead flow from, that play an active part in, again, the decision-making process for the customer, because they'll be sitting there asking, Microsoft, whoever, what do you think about this company or that company? And then when you swing around the other way and you talk to people in for example, AWS is a really good example, or Azure, Microsoft and AWS don't put fingers on keyboards, nor do, Salesforce. They need small or large GSIs, systems integrators, professional services businesses, to do a lot of the implementation for them if their prospective clients can't. They often also need help, or their clients often need help with managing these things. So, there are partners across the kind of tech sphere, and it's important to understand their view on the situation. Now, some people say, well, actually, partner should be a thing in its own right. You should do like a MEDDPICC for the partner. And I think that's one way of doing it. That's perfectly fine. Just from my perspective, in terms of using it as a kind of a way of remembering to touch on it, I put it into MEDDPICC just so I don't forget it. But the most important thing is not whether it's in MEDDPICC or you do a separate MEDDPICC for the partner, but that you're aware of it and you cover it and you kind of understand, well, what's their, what's important to them fundamentally. It always comes back to what's important to the individual. So the paper process, so sometimes you see MEDDPICC without the P. I think anybody who has been caught out by a deal that was definitely going to happen, it was definitely going to land, but something happened on the way to getting the piece of paper, the documentation signed, this is going to be really important to them. So it's that kind of classic once bitten, twice shy. And the way to think about the paper process is, what's the physical path that your paperwork's going to take? So back in the days before there was e-signatures and DocuSigns, it was like, I'm going to have to send a fax, or I'm going to have to send a PDF that someone's going to have to print out. Whose desks or whose inboxes is it going to land in before it gets to the person who actually signs it off? And then do we know the person who's signing off? Because sometimes the person who's signing off, isn't the problem owner. They're not even the economic buyer. They might just be sitting there waiting, saying, I'm the signatory for the company. So obviously I'm kind of involved in some way, but I need my CFO or my VP of finance or my accountant to say, yeah, happy for you to sign off that. I need my lawyer to say, yeah, happy for you to sign off that. I need the business unit owners to be happy with that. I want my human resources person to come in and say they're kind of happy with that. So who are the people who need to check the paperwork, the deal, the terms and conditions, that it's happy before it gets to the person that actually ultimately makes the signs the paperwork? Implicate the pain. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking with about pain, and whether it's implicate, whether it's identify, whether it's irritate. But fundamentally, I'm probably just going to spend a second and highlight these bad boys here. Fundamentally, I, stands for pain. And there's a very funny story about when the guys who came up with MEDDPICC did it. They had to, they wanted to make it a word that people would remember, that was easy to remember. So, they had, and it also was, it didn't have it had 2Ds, it didn't have, the partner or the paper process at the time. So they had pain. So it's like, well, how are we going to fit pain in to, this acronym that we're building? And I can't remember who the guy is, but he talks about, he was the guy who had to explain to the boss why, pain starts with an I in MEDDPICC. So it's quite a funny aside. But the important thing is, I think it's, the key here is that I've put implicate as the kind of main one, because implicate is like about pointing out. The main thing is to know that like this changes throughout time in terms of what you're doing with the pain. Yes, you know what the pain is, but you need to build on it, evolve it, create urgency around it as you go through. So we'll come back to that in lots of detail. Competition, so fairly straightforward in terms of, who are your key competitors, but, these days, the biggest competitor is no decision. So it's understanding, the situation, the status quo. And again, that no decision links to the pain. What is the pain that they're currently struggling with? How do we make no decision seem like the least acceptable option? And then, champion, classic, and we'll come on and talk a bit about champions and why they're so important, and the need not to confuse a champion with a fan or a coach, because oftentimes the first person we speak to who seems a bit excited about it, we assume they're a champion, and that's not necessarily the case. So this is my version of MEDDPICC. This is the kind of version I coach and I teach. And in the next section, we're going to start to drill into pain, and we're going to start to drill into metrics and how these get used in a typical sales process. So continuing to dive deep into pain. when we think about starting with pain, you start by identifying the pain, implicating the pain, and irritate the pain. What is it we're kind of actually doing here? And I'm using my playbook throughout the videos. You'll see, because this is where this is kind of where a lot of my thinking. I kind of got it down into paper. So this is, if you haven't got access to this, I've said this so many times in this video. If you haven't got access to this, then there's a link in the description, or DM me and I'll send you access. But in general, when we're thinking about pain, actually, let me just pause before I think about pain. One of the things I see a lot with MEDDPICC rollouts, one of the kind of classic kind of issues I see with MEDDPICC rollouts is there's a real emphasis on the what. Like, what are you trying to get? What is the information we need? And do we have it? You tend to get a little bit of the why. Why is this important? And some of it's sort of self-explanatory. I know why, it's important to understand, metrics, to have kind of a view of who the economic buyer is, whatever it might be. But what we don't, or what I don't see a lot of, is the when. So actually, when do you need to start thinking about getting access to these bits of information or individuals or whatever it might be? And I see even less of the how. So if you don't have metrics, how do you go about getting them? How do you go about establishing them? If you don't know who the economic buyer is, how do you go about trying to understand who that might be? What are the tools, tactics, techniques you can use to get through that? So this is why the user guide is really important to me, because it's not, it's not just the what and the why, it's the when and the how. This is the tactical application of MEDDPICC, so that it stops being a checklist and a framework and starts to become a, dare I say, a methodology or a process by which you can create value for your clients, help them through a buying decision, and ultimately get to an outcome that's great for both of you. And that's what we want as salespeople, really, right? We want to help our customers to alleviate pain and achieve the goals and things that they're looking for. So identify, implicate, and irritate pain, and we've touched on this already. But one of the things, and a guy called the name of Chris Orlob talks about this a lot, is you need to be looking for not just a pain, but the pain, not just a problem, but the problem. A really good sort of litmus test for this is when you think about your own organizations and you think about all hands calls or meetings with leadership, leaders will typically have a stump speech about what's important to them in the business and what they need to be focusing on. And they'll be like, normally it's 3 or 5 things, right? Because those numbers seem to pop up. It might be 2, it might be 7, but normally it's like 3 or 5. And they'll be the strategic priorities for the business. So like in 2025, these are our 3 strategic priorities. We need to penetrate the financial services market because that's where the high growth customers are. We need to do that with this product that we specially built for it. And we need to make sure that we are surprising and delighting our existing customers to retain them. So it's about entering new markets, and it's about acquiring higher value business, and it's about retaining the customers that we've got, something like that. So you'll see various different versions, normally much more articulate, much more business centric than the ones I've just spouted there. And the question you need to ask yourself is, by helping my clients solve the problem I think they have, or I suspect they have, will it help the overall business achieve those 3 to 5 goals that have been set out by leadership? So if I think back to a few years ago, lots of organizations were very gung-ho about the cloud. It was like, we're trying to get into the cloud. So they would talk about getting into the cloud so that they could be a more agile operating business, better leverage their data, and reduce their capital expenditure. So they're real clear. So cloud was one of the big things. So you're selling to organizations, and you could sell, you could help them get into the cloud. That was a really good kind of straight line from, right, you're trying to get into the cloud so that you can, make great use of this data you've got, become a more agile business, reduce your cost, and that's a problem we solve for. So it's a fairly straight line. But if you do something like, I don't know, some kind of payroll software or some kind of Salesforce plugin or whatever it might be, it's worth taking time to understand how you might articulate how the problem you solve helps them get closer to their goal, and the kind of typical issues and problems that you see. So this kind of identifying the pain that your customer is suffering from that you can solve for. That is your what is my market struggling with? What are the issues that they have that we're helping them with, that we're seeing in our case studies and so on? And from that, you want to build almost like exactly like a value hypothesis, an ingoing, hypothesis as to how you can help that business. And I'm going to just very quickly switch to a tools slide that talks about this. So when you think about business goals, and you're thinking about, right, how do I identify the pain? How do I build my sort of hypothesis so that I can go in and start to kind of implicate the pain? You want to think about, right, this is my customer's business broken down from the board to their individual kind of business units. There are some really generic ones here. And if you are, if they're a big public company, it's kind of easy to get some of this information, but it's also a lot of time shared on their website. You can go onto Companies House or the SEC to get a 10K filing, whatever it might be. But this information is broadly available, and things like following your customer's CEO or your prospect CEO on Twitter or on LinkedIn, you'll get a really clear view from all the kind of marketing statements. Like investor relations are great sources for information for what their kind of priorities are. And then you want to think about it in terms of like 4 layers. I like to think about it. So what are their strategic goals? So these are the big, hairy goals that they might have in terms of entering a new market, hitting new revenue, surprising, delighting customers, reducing operating costs, becoming a more agile operation, better cash control. HR might be, top 10 workplaces in the country, or employee satisfaction index or Glassdoor, whatever it might be. So think of what are the big strategic goals, and typically they all start in the board, and whatever the board has decided they're trying to achieve, they then kind of divide those out into portions and say, right, sales, you've got to do this, you've got to get the revenue number. Marketing, you've got to drive this much brand awareness and leads into sales. Operations, you're going to have to fulfill this amount of sales volume. IT, you need to support these number of people with this business, and also we're going to want a better website and better product, whatever it might be. Finance, HR, and so on. So what are the big strategic goals? So that's step 1. Step 2, what are the performance indicators that they'll use to track how they're achieving against these goals? So, sales, we're all very sort of familiar with KPIs. So it might be average order value, close ratio, etc. Marketing might be MQLs. Finance might be debtor days, or I don't know. I'm not the best when it comes to finance acronyms. Cash control, cash on hand, net profit, gross EBITDA, one of those things. Anyway, so think about what their different kind of key performance metrics are going to be, and then think about, so there'll be the goals, there'll be the KPIs, and there'll be the projects that sit underneath those that actually they are investing time, effort, and energy in to help underpin these. So I used to have a boss. He was the CRO of the organization I worked for, and he was Spanish, so he got the analogy wrong. He was talking about like having 6 bullets in your gun, and so you can only fire 6 times. But he was used to say, "I've only got a small amount of dynamite, so I've got to plant it very carefully." So again, this is, this strategy literally means it's the allocation of scarce resources. So you've only got a limited amount of stuff. So where are you spending your time? So what are the projects that they are investing in to drive towards their chosen goals? And every one of these departments will have some kind of project or something that they're driving for in 2025. And they do that because it helps align resources, it helps get budget, and it helps them kind of push things forward. So A great IT one might be that whole kind of cloud piece, or it might be, security posture. Sales might be implementing a new sales methodology, or new sales tech, or AI SDRs, whatever it might be. But there'll be important projects that they're putting in place to do this, and then there'll be what I refer to as unknown issues. What I mean by unknown issues isn't issues that we don't know, and it isn't issues that they don't know, but it's more kind of like these are the problems that are coming about in the market with our customers, as our customers are trying to achieve whatever these goals might be, or how they are reacting to the macroeconomic climate. So it's kind of like, what do I know? Pardon me. What do I know about my customers, about their industry, about their marketplace that helps me, helps inform me about the problems and challenges they might be having, addressing these. This is you could almost call this, insights, for want of a better phrase. There we go. So unknown. So these, and as I say, they're not necessarily unknown, but they're in the shadows. They're not clear and present. But you, as a consultative sales individual, someone who's leading with value, can share that kind of information to help guide them. And you might have seen other organizations deliver cloud migrations, for example, in the past, and the kind of issues they have. Typically, it takes longer than you think. You end up with double licensing costs. Any number of things can go wrong. Your cloud spend will be higher than you thought. Your discount from your vendor, whether it's AWS or Microsoft, based on your volume, you'll probably struggle to achieve that. So you'll have to put more stuff in to get there. All these kind of, these issues that you'll have seen as a sales and business professional that others have struggled with, that you can share with them to help guide them. And again, this is a really helpful mental model. So once you've gone through this process, and this doesn't need to be particularly pretty or particularly detailed. It can be sort of back of a fag packet, a little bit of research, a cup of coffee and a cigarette, thought process with a 10K, their website, their LinkedIn, and then just what you know about your case studies in your market. And you can come up with 2 or 3 ideas. Then when you're starting to think about, okay, what is the pain, you have, didn't mean to do that, you have your kind of well-researched hypothesis based on their challenges that you can then use to start to both, prospect to, so you can use that to create compelling messaging. And you also have things to talk about when you get into those discovery calls in terms of, these are the things I typically see. I think it's Kristen Connors does this thing where she talks about the pain buckets. She'll say, I speak to, chief revenue officers, several times a week, and typically their pains fall into 1 of 3 buckets. It's either A, B, or C. Does any of that resonate with you? And that's a really good kind of high level way of thinking about, when you do this exercise and you start to think, okay, right, I had a thought about this organization in particular, get a bit more kind of specific if you're in enterprise, or if you're in SME, then it can be more generic, more kind of what's the typical business in this space struggling with, going to be set up. You can then build that pain bucket conversational talk track. You can have a conversation around that. You can have some questions written to delve in and pick at that to find if you're getting to the right pain. And then once you've got that, it's about how you then engage, ask those questions, to start to kind of peel the onion on this, to get layer below layer. And I've got a separate playbook, a separate video on discovery that I can link to. I might do a few bits on discovery as part of this as well. But it's identifying that pain, right? And I probably spent longer than I wanted to on this, but it's identifying that typical ICP, the problems you solve, and then building a talk track, question track off the back of it. Then it's implicating the pain. So you've identified the pain, and you know they're probably going to have that as being an organization that you're targeting. Implicate the pain is about making the customer see it. When you have that conversation, that example of those pain buckets, does it resonate? Do they pick up on it? And then it's that question, we talked about a minute ago, when you're thinking about, can I help them achieve their overall strategic goals? You should absolutely ask that question to your prospect. So, and the way you might ask that might be something along the lines of, when you think about your CEO or CRO's top 3 to 5 strategic goals 2025, does solving this kind of a problem fit into those sort of 3, 4, 5 goals? You just kind of ask the question. So this sits very much, let's say, in that discovery process. The irritation of the pain, you start to get into this in the discovery process as well, where you start to, ask those kind of classic impact questions. So, what are the knock-on effects of this problem? What would happen if you didn't get this problem solved in the next kind of 6 to 9 months? What might be the impact on you and the team? And I try not to say impact these days because it's a very salesy. We've oversalesed it. We've salesed it to death. The word impact, but effect, knock-on, second-order effects, knock-on effects, whatever it might be. Good ways of asking that pain. This is about, again, trying to create some agitation, create some urgency. Now, as you're going through this kind of, it's almost like a funnel, isn't it? Funneling from it, it's a broad pain that they might have. It's a pain you identify they do have, and it's irritated enough to see that, it needs solving. This is where metrics start to fit in really nicely. So when you're thinking about the business pain and the business needs, key performance indicators are a great way of getting quantifiable metrics, hard metrics from them. So you can think about the industry in general. Typically, industry stats are quite broad. They tend to show trends. They don't always tend to apply to that particular organization. But then if you go a layer in and ask them about how they're performing against average order value, cost of acquisition, lifetime value, whatever the key KPI might be, you start to get closer to understanding, okay, what are they performing at? And more important, what would they like to be performing at? So you might find that an organization is converting 1 in 10 of their sales, and you might think, oh, that's awful, you need to be at 2 or 3, and they might be, actually, that's fine because of the volume of leads we get and the kind of business we do. You start to get those KPIs start to become real when you start to have those conversations. So as you're having those kind of conversations, and as you're starting to move down from identifying the pain, that kind of realigns with those sort of generic industry metrics. Implicating the pain, that starts to align with the KPIs, the company metrics. And then irritating the pain, that's about building a really solid business case that can go through the economic buyer, it can go through finance, it can go through whatever it might be, whatever kind of procurement process they might have, and address specific metrics that are relevant to that business. So, include metrics, industry metrics, in your kind of your prospecting and first call decks as a kind of a guide. I tend to be a big fan of the word typical when I'm having discovery calls, because it presents a position. So you're not saying, this is you. You're saying typically in the industry, this is what I see. So it's not like they can't be mad at you, or you can't be getting it wrong because that's what you're seeing. But it's that typically I see this. It's like the pain bucket question. Typically I see this. What's it like for you? Does that ring true for you? And you might get nodding in agreement. You might get something very different. But either way, you're starting to get to actual facts around metrics and the kind of things that they're seeing. And then a really great question, not mine, that I like to use is, what metrics are suffering as a result of this? What are the kind of hard numbers that are being damaged as a result of not being able to do this or having to deal with that, whatever it might be? And that's your kind of company metrics part. So it's a good question to ask. And then as you build momentum and so on, really a lot of people talk about ROI, but I think much more these days it's the cost of inaction. So particularly where we have this stasis around decision making, this difficulty about making decisions, it's trying to assess the impact of doing nothing. So if you imagine that, their goal is here, but because of the problem they're suffering, they're kind of trending down that way, over 6, 9, 12 months, the gap is just going to get bigger. There you go. I don't know if I've done that right in the camera, but it's that delta between what you'd like, where you'd like to be, and where you actually are, is going to get bigger. And if you think about it being at, if it's only trending at 2% and it's still trending at 2% in 6 months' time, that 2% is compounded. So actually, from a absolute perspective, it might look more like 8, 10%. So cost of inaction, that's a good way of starting to sort of figure out how you then pay for, how business then sort of justifies the cost of your solution by doing that level of analysis. And typically, just jump in here, typically as you start to go through the kind of solution exploration phase, that's when you want to start looking at these company metrics and starting to get into the business case metrics, so you can address that concern. So pain and metrics very closely tied together. One comes first, which is the pain, but metrics follow hot on your feet, and you want to be trying to quantify at each stage what the value of the pain, or if you can quantify the pain. Sometimes just asking, like, can you quantify that? Can you quantify the effect of that? Is a good way to get people to stop and think. And you're getting people to think like that and sort of stop in their tracks is a really good way of, it's you're adding value, you're making them think differently. Don't necessarily jump in and suggest a bunch of things straight away. Give them a minute to think, but if they're still struggling, then give them some suggestions or things you see elsewhere. But try and create that moment where they go, well, as soon as you get things like that, you're in a good place. You've asked some good questions. It's really getting them thinking differently. And in this document as well, and we will come back to this, I have included some questions. So, implicating the pain. What are the knock-on effects of the issue? What's driving the urgency? If we jump forward 6 months, how would you feel if this problem wasn't solved? How do you feel if this problem wasn't solved? And then metrics. Could you quantify the effect this is having? Key business measures that are suffering. How could you measure the effect? And how much time or money has this cost the business, roughly speaking, so far? So, got plenty more questions like this, but this is a good kind of all one pager on those kind of questions that you can use. So we've talked through how we look for pain, different types of pain, and metrics, and a decision-making unit as part of that initial sales motion, be it prospecting, and then more pertinently in the discovery phase, where we're going in and asking deep questions to get to these pain points and these metrics. And I thought it might be useful at this point to just switch gears and look at some discovery questions that you can use to power yourself through to kind of bring out these pains and these metrics. So this is I love a cheat sheet, and if you follow me or you've downloaded any of my content, you'll know it's all about cheat sheets. It's about how do you make things easier for yourself? How do you avoid forgetting kind of the things that you do naturally because you're under pressure? If you think about like high performing athletes or airline, fighter pilots, astronauts, etc., one of the common threads is they have checklists, right? An astronaut, a fighter pilot, they have a checklist. They understand what they're doing when, and they use different sort of tools, techniques, booklets, whatever you want to call them, to make sure that they're going through their process. Doesn't mean they don't know the process, doesn't mean they're following a script. These are just jogs to the memory. These are cues. And got a whole bunch of different sort of questions that I've collected and stolen from various different sales managers or salespeople that I've worked with, other people I've seen on LinkedIn, even people like a Tim Ferriss or a Jeremy Paxman, interviewers, where you can find like a really great question. And this is one of the things I talk about with my clients is, as a professional seller, you should be like collecting questions. There's an old anecdote about Ronald Reagan, and he used to collect whims and stories and one-liners and jokes, and he'd write them down and he'd keep them, and he always would appear like you have these things off the cuff, but no, he collected them for years. He studied them. He'd think about the ones he might want to use in particular occasions that might relate to what's going on. This is the same should be true for yourself and questions. So in that initial part of the sales process, that discovery section, it's these pain problem questions that you want to be digging into. So we've talked about, priorities. Where does this sit within your CXO's boss's list of priorities, whatever it might be? How long has this been an issue? So again, I'm trying to understand how long the problems sit there, whether there's urgency around it or not, or whether it is something that wasn't so painful initially and has built to become more painful over time. Can you give real life example of the problem? So asking people to recall situations where they've struggled with that problem, it makes it visceral, it makes it real to them. They have to go back into their memory banks and recount, for want of a better phrase, kind of workplace trauma, workplace pain. Who else is feeling the pain of this problem? So, trying to, we talked, about the decision-making unit. Who else is involved in this? Those kind of questions. And this is the next one is the implication questions or the impact questions. Like I said, I try and avoid using the word impact these days. I think it's a bit too salesy, but, what are the knock-on effects? How's this I've used impact there, but okay. How's it impacting the team, the business? What's driving the urgency around solving this now? That's a great question I hear. Some really, top-notch, thought leaders on sales you talk about and use on LinkedIn, your Kirsten O'Connors, your Crystal Lobs, and so on. May I ask a direct question? How's this affecting you personally? So, getting permission to go and ask something a bit more painful. Be careful how you use that one. You've got to build up some trust and engagement over time. But this is if you haven't got one of these, I highly recommend either creating your own or stealing mine, or doing both, steal mine and add to it and take away the ones that don't work. But in that initial discovery phase, really what you're looking at is to identify and implicate the pain, start to get to metrics, understand that decision-making unit and kind of where the partner sits in this. And once you've done that, that there is a problem to solve. So if we go back to our our MEDDPICC list, we'll have a view of, right, we know there's a pain. Let me just whack some highlighter on that. So we know we've got a pain. We know we have some metrics, okay, and we are getting a feel for the decision-making unit as well. In fact, I might just make this one green just for the sake of, saying we definitely know, like we have a goer. Very pale green. So that's the kind of discovery process. Then once you've done that with your first call, you're probably going to find you're going to need to do this again, particularly if it's an enterprise account or even a mid-enterprise account where you've got multiple stakeholders. You're probably going to need to do this again or ask some of these questions again with other members of that decision-making unit. So you're going to want to check back that you understand these are what the pain points are, and you understand that these are what the metrics that they're suffering from. So you need to go back and check all the way along. And this is kind of, I suppose, is one of the most important things to remember about MEDDPICC is it is not static. It is not a tick box. Once you get an answer, that answer does not necessarily stay the same all the way through the sales journey or the buying process from the customer side. You need to be checking back that the pain is still real, that the metrics are still right, because metrics change over time. So unless you've got like a really fast turnaround SMB quick hit thing, you're going to want to be checking this. And even in those cases, I suggest that you're constantly checking back and checking back in that these are still the case. Then we move on to actually how you manage the opportunity. So obviously, once we've identified that there is pain and we've got some metrics that justify making a buying decision or moving into action, it's about managing that opportunity. And this is where like the bulk of work from a MEDDPICC perspective comes out. So originally, remember when this framework, when MEDDPICC was kind of produced, it was done to answer a particular problem that that the organisation where it was created. I wish I could remember what their name, PCT, TPC, something like that. I really should know. But if you read the Qualified Sales Leader, which is a really, really fantastic book, MEDDPICC was built to solve a problem, and the problem was their forecasting was poor, deals weren't moving quickly enough, and they had a kind of low win rate. So the MEDDPICC, as it was then, framework was brought in to say, right, what do we need to understand to make sure that we can interrogate our pipeline and be happy that they are real deals worth spending time on, that we can, and from the information we've got, we know what the next steps are to kind of move those pieces of business forward. So a lot of this is designed around opportunity management. So the first piece, again, is around implicating and irritating that pain. So if we go to the, sorry, these are my notes. If we go back to this, the classic buying cycle, and an organization has gone from, do we have a problem? How significant is it? Is it recognized across key stakeholders? Does it warrant action? Once you start to get yeses to some of those questions with one individual, a couple of individual, and it starts to warrant action or certainly warrant further exploration, you move into this solution exploration phase. And this is where, if you're thinking about it purely from like a CRM perspective, you go from like first meeting held into, it's proper pipeline now. I can size and shape it. I've got a feeling for it. I know it's a deal. I know there's an opportunity there. So put yourself in the customer's shoes for a second, right? The customer's going to be thinking, well, what option? So this is a problem that we need to solve. What options do we have? What are the potential solutions out there? And you're going to see there's a combination of things, whether it might be yourself, vendors or suppliers like you. There might be suppliers that aren't like you but solve the problem in a different way. There might be other solutions such as outsourcing that aspect of the business. Again, that might be a solution that you can't provide. It might be selling the part of the business where that problem exists, or it might be building something internally, doing something internally that doesn't involve you. But either way, they're going to have a range of different options. Now, a lot of the time, organizations will choose to buy, but at the same time, a lot of the time they may go, do you know what, can we fix this ourselves? Do we have someone in house who knows how to whiz something up in AWS? Do we have a programmer who knows how to build a quick application? Can we use no code, low code tools, which is particularly the flavor of things at the moment to solve that? So what options do they have? Then it's what criteria should we use to make a decision about where we go? And this is when talked about the decision-making criteria. So I jump into here, talk about the decision-making criteria. So price, features, locations, etc. What are the criteria that they are thinking about using to make that decision? And then which provider best meets those criteria? So those are the kind of three questions that they'll be trying to answer in a roundabout way within their organization. Now, and I can't stress this enough, and I'll say it again, and I don't apologize for repeating myself on this one. We have to try and make MEDDPICC about the customer. It's very easy to run away and think about it, about our qualification process and what we need to do. But you need to start with the customer in mind. So when we think about the aspects that sit within the solution exploration and what the customers are going through, we're going to be thinking about, right, have they identified the pain? Have they got the metrics? Right, got that. Decision criteria. What are the factors that they're going to use to make that decision? Now, sales is an act of leadership. So this is where we have an opportunity to help them evaluate the criteria they're going to use. We can suggest criteria, particularly if we've got knowledge of how purchases like this have gone before with similar businesses or other customers who are trying to solve a similar kind of problem. And we might use a phrase like, typically customers I talk to tend to prioritize these 3 things or these 5 things. It might be functionality, security, price, location, support, I don't know. But we'll have a view on the things, price aside, because like price is always there. We'll have a view on what the most important or what the most common criteria that come up are, and what tend to be important to organisations, so we can help lead them. What you'll also find is that different stakeholders have different views on what criteria are important. So somebody from finance, for example, might have a very different view from someone from marketing and from someone from IT. They'll have completely different views on what the kind of top criteria is potentially. Now, a lot of the time it will be, have we solved that problem? And have we done it at a reasonable expense? And to solve that problem, we need to do these 3, 4, 5 things. But this is where you need to invest time and effort to actually pull out those decision criteria. So if we jump into our user guide and we think about decision-making criteria, where are we? Here we go. So all the criteria that stakeholders will need to make an informed decision, and this will include functionality, technical, security, legal, and financial. So this is where it's important to think about the different decision makers in that decision-making unit. Some of them will be, they won't be the owner of the problem. One of the things I see a lot is when I sell into organizations, I get people like some, to a certain extent, sales enablement, but particularly HR. They might own the resolution of the problem. They might be asked to go out and get some training, some coaching to help develop people. That is their remit, their goal, but they might not viscerally feel the pain of the problem on a day-to-day basis. The closest they might get to it is their partner in sales turning around and saying to them, look, we really need to solve this. We've got some issues in this part of our business that we need solving through training, coaching, and development. So they take that, the HR person takes it as a requirement, and they know they need to fill it to fulfill their job. But it's not, what's the pain to them? What's in it for them? It's to get the CRO off their back, to tick a box towards kind of their overall objectives for the year. Important, yes. Burning urgency, staring into their soul to find their deepest, darkest worries and fears, not so much. So sometimes you need to do some work around there to understand what's important to them, why it's important to them, and pulling that kind of information out and putting it next to the problem owner's key decision criteria, because the problem owner might be sitting there thinking, we need this kind of thing, we need to deploy it really quickly, and it needs to be an XYZ. But somebody from HR or somebody from legal might be, well, we need to avoid these particular terms or these financial penalties. Security, like CISO, might be, we need the data stored in this sovereign territory with this level of security, so on and so forth. So there's work to be done there, even in the smallest sale, to make sure you tick some of these boxes. Why? There's plenty of people in an opportunity that can say no, and very few people that can say yes. But to get to the people that can say yes, you've got to go through the people that can say no first. When to start to pull this out, as soon as you start to get clarity that there's an opportunity. So asking kind of quite direct and quite open questions like, what do you think the most important things are going to be when making a decision? How important is service compared to security? What are procurement going to be interested when deciding on this? What are HR going to be interested in? So start to ask those kind of questions to surface those decision criteria. And then do you want to do some comparing and contrasting? So people always talk about being priced, but at what point we can kind of just making this up as I go along, but at what point does the lack of functionality start to impact on the price you're willing to pay? So there's kind of get to these trade-offs. Another good one might be service quality versus security, as I put an example in there. How does one compare to the other? And what you'll probably find is different people have slightly different views, but you want to try and build a consensus of not just what the buying criteria are, but like stack ranking them. You can even ask that question. Once you start to get these out on the table, once you've got 4 or 5 out on the table, you can say to somebody, if you had to price aside, because like it's just easier to put opinion price. Price aside, how would you stack rank these decision criteria in order of importance? And when you get start to work through that, you can start to pick off the ones, at the bottom. You say, so actually, this is the least important one. How important is it going to be in the overall factor? Because what you want to find is you might find you've got 10, 15, 20 requirements, but it's only the top 6 or 7 that are really important. Everything else is just nice to have. And in fact, that's another good way of asking it. So, look, where's the line from must have to nice to have sit on that list? And you need to do this across some stakeholder groups. So things to avoid is, particularly when we talk about multi-threading, and I'll come on and talk about multi-threading later. Things to avoid is getting everybody on a call or putting it in an email to everybody and trying to get some consensus, because the chances are no one's going to want to go first. There might be some leader there who asks somebody or just says these are 3 things. Everyone else will be quiet. It's just a really awkward thing. What do you want to do? I can't remember who talks about this, but multi-threading, stakeholder management, that's not like one to many. That's just lots of one to one. All right. And then when you bring everybody together for like a meeting or for like a presentation, and you've got 3 or 4 or 5 people on there, you want to be in a situation where you've spoken to them all one to one. You've gone through this and you kind of understand where they're all sitting and where the differences might be. Like that's what good looks like around this, particularly around decision criteria. So that when you do that presentation back, you stack rank them, where the like must-haves are and the nice-to-haves are, what's going to be important to the most powerful people in the room, and what's important to people who maybe sit slightly below the power line, but also having an idea, and again I'll talk about this in multi-threading, but idea of how the influence between people below the power line, people above the power line comes in. So as you get into that, this opportunity is real. This is when you need to start to pull out the decision criteria, so that you can, shape your offering, shape how you position your demo, right? Because if you're a SaaS business and you're doing a demo, you need to understand what are the problems that we're solving so you can demonstrate those features, and what's important to you about making a decision so that you can highlight those when you're doing that demo, particularly if it's a quick turnaround deal type. So once we've done decision criteria, then you want to start thinking about the decision-making process. So how are you, as an organization, actually going to start to make a decision? And this is where we come back to the decision-making unit. So it's thinking about like who's involved, at what stage, what has to happen to release budget. Do you have particular signing ceremonies? Do you have budgetary constraints each quarter that are going to maybe affect when this happens? But that decision-making process then starts to become really important. So if we just jump to our user guide, think about the decision-making process. So some organizations have got a really clear, well-defined sort of buying process. Some organizations is a bit haphazard, some are somewhere in between. And different types of products will have different processes as well. So hopefully there's some kind of blueprint you can follow. Hopefully you're working with somebody who's been involved with that kind of decision in the past and can give you a bit of a guide. But your job really here is to help them make the right decision. Now, we all like to think that's us and our product, but the reality of the situation is sometimes it's not. And we often need to be kind of honest about that. If we think we are the wrong product, then it's a hard thing to do, but you get a lot of credibility, and it's a great way of delaying reward, because you never know, 3, 5, 7 years down the line, you might find you win a very big deal because you're transparent with somebody at the time and told them you might not be the right sort of product or solution for them. Your boss might not like it, but I don't know, moral quandary for you to grapple with. But ultimately, it's about, let's make MEDDPICC about the customer. Let's make about helping them go through their decision process. So this is about helping them make a decision. And sales is an act of leadership. So one of the things you can do when you start to sort of qualify the opportunity and you understand the pain and the metrics, and you're starting to fish out some decision-making criteria, is to understand how they do the process. So you might want to ask, when you've made decisions like this in the past, um, what's the process been? How have you been involved? Who has typically made the decision? And typically, I mean, it's probably my favorite word in sales at the moment, because it's a great way of like floating ideas or testing things with clients, and giving them an opportunity to kind of either agree or take your leadership or shoot you down in flames and just say that's not how they're doing. But either way, you get a response, which is good. So, it might be that you have a customer that hasn't made this decision before, and you kind of outline what the next steps are. So, after a discovery call, typically clients will want to see a demo of the key features. The individuals they'll typically have to have involved, and that will be somebody from security, somebody from HR, end user, manager, whatever. But the kind of people that are going to be involved, hopefully, in that decision-making unit that we talked about earlier on, and the fact that they need to be involved so that you can get access to them. And kind of understanding, what, or sort of sharing the process that others have been through in terms of evaluating your product or service. Particularly if that's like a proof of concept or a test piece of work or a small initial engagement. Sharing how others have done it, and being that leader, showing what good looks like. When customers have made really great decisions, these are the kind of things they've gone through, and these are the kind of people who've been involved from early on, and so on and so forth. So really, you are setting yourself up for success. But yeah, I think it is, as you start to get into that opportunity, it's like, it's that question is, when you've made a decision like this before, who's been involved, what's the process look like, how long has it taken, so on and so forth. And if they haven't, it's okay, like trying to understand the reason why they haven't. It might be someone's new into the role, and so they just haven't been through a buying process before, or it might be this is a type of software or type of solution that they've just never bought before, and that's where you can jump in and provide leadership and sort of how it's typically done. Now, all while we're talking about the decision criteria and decision process, I would, and I haven't popped it down here, but maybe I should, I would also always be checking about who's involved, who are the decision-making unit. So you might have a few ideas initially, and you might have got a few names from early on, but as you expand the number of people you're speaking with within an opportunity, you'll want to understand who else is involved. Now, there's kind of a balancing act between many hands make light work and too many cooks spoil the broth with the number of decision makers in a decision making unit. If you get too many people involved, you can tend to get analysis paralysis. If you don't have enough, you won't get through. So it's about having the right people involved at the right time, the right level of seniority, which is why it's always good if you can get an opportunity to get in front of the C-suite. I will touch on the C-suite later in this video. But we've done the decision criteria, we've done the decision process, we've asked how they're going to make the decision, we've asked the process for making a decision. The next one to think about is kind of competition. So this is a kind of an interesting one, because it depends how strong you are. So first of all, you want to understand, who you're competing with in terms of direct competitors, or, I suppose that's the first thing to do. And like you can ask that. You can ask if they're talking to anybody else in this space. You can look at who's connected to your competitors on LinkedIn. That's kind of a favorite of mine. You can look at tools like Built With to understand if your competitor's software is sitting in their sort of technology stack. Particularly if it's an inbound, it's like, who else are you talking to? If it's outbound, it's like asking how are they currently solving those problems and who else they would consider when looking to use a solution like yours. There's no, like, some people think, oh, if I ask about competition, then that puts it on their mind and they're going to go and look at others. They're going to look at others anyway. Someone in that business is probably going to say, you need a competitive quote. We need to go through a process. We should evaluate other vendors when we're doing this. Very rarely, is it just going to be you or nothing, right? So don't be a fool. Ask the question and ask what would be required for them to consider moving away from their existing solution if they already have like a current vendor in place. So about trying to stack rank the competition. And one of the things you might want to do, and again, this depends on how confident you are around the whole competition point, is you might, like, you might want to complement your competition. So you might want to say, I don't know, Salesforce is an incredibly powerful tool. It can do a lot more for your business overall. Whereas, Pipedrive is simpler and easier for the salespeople to use, but it doesn't scale, as well. It doesn't touch as many different parts of the business. So you can just talk factually about what they do well, but what they don't do so well. Now you can think about, when making statements like that, it's probably worth thinking about what's important to them, so that, where are the pain points, what are the decision criteria, and then positioning what you say so that the good things that you say about your competitors are kind of like nice to haves, and maybe the areas where you think they might fall down are kind of the must haves, and it takes a bit of time and confidence and practice to do that. One of the things I know, a seller, and she was very good at this. She would always say, "Look, if you're seeing a demo from us, you should also see a demo from these other guys as well." And the reason she did that is because she knew her solution was stronger in certain areas, and whenever she had a customer who had that kind of thing, it was like, "I'm going to talk to them," because she kind of knew it would come back and she'd be all right. And also, particularly if you're getting there first and it's an outbound conversation, you can start to, rig the game, as Chris Orlob likes to say. You can start to kind of associate key decision-making criteria with the aspects of your product or service that are really, really, really strong. So you're building out a set of decision criteria that map really well to the things you're doing, you're doing well, so that when they take that and then go and talk to one or two other providers, it's like, okay, no, that's not quite as good. Or it does some things, but not quite as good as the others. It's something that I'm really aware of with my service offering, because it's just me. There are things I can do that don't scale well that I tend to offer included in my my package, my bundles, and I offer them for free because I know they're easy for me to deliver, but they actually have a lot of value to the client, but they're kind of harder for larger organizations to deliver because they just don't have that kind of agility. So it's worth really considering how you map about your competitors. Don't, for goodness sake, don't like close your eyes and pray and hope they don't get involved, or the client doesn't go and talk to competitors. They absolutely will. And the chances are that your biggest competition, particularly if you got there first and you did a good job, identified the pain, chances are your biggest competition is going to be no decision. So it becomes then about how do you, making sure that, how do you make sure that no decision inertia isn't the issue here, and actually they make a decision, and again, if you've done the groundwork well, like 6, 7 times out of 10, it'll go your way. Okay, so we're going to talk a bit about the champion now, and the term champion gets used a lot, particularly within MEDDPICC, but also, just in generally within sales. Some methodologies talk about like the idea of a coach, so particularly Miller Hyman, for example, talk about a coach. Some methodologies talk about like a center of dissatisfaction, or a sort of problem owner, or a fan. But really thinking about, why a champion is so important, or multiple champions, particularly if you're doing kind of, I'd say, anything that looks like an enterprise deal, you're going to want to have, a couple of potential champions at least that you can work with, just because each champion will see different parts of the business, different parts of the issue, will have a slightly different view on it and a slightly different sphere of influence. So when we're thinking about a champion, I always think that you want a champion to have 4 things, and like everything that I'm talking through in this video, this is something that I have, borrowed, stolen, evolved on from somebody else. But this idea that a champion has these 4 things, right? They have authority to make decisions. They may not be the economic buyer. They may not necessarily have like a big budget, but they have decision making capability, right? They can say yes as well as no. They have influence on their peers and their seniors. So their opinion matters to people who sit adjacent to them in the organizations, and people who sit above them, and quite frankly, people sit below them because a lot of the time, champions, you want them to be internal leaders and bring some of the maybe less powerful on paper individuals within a decision-making unit, bring them with you because they're thinking, oh, if so and so thinks this is a good idea, then we trust them. We'll go with it. They have to be motivated to actually take action. So, they need to benefit and see the benefit of making the purchasing decision and implementing the solution, the product, the service, whatever it might be. There needs to be a clear kind of motivation for that. And again, like we talked about earlier on around the different things that drive people to to buy. For your champion, it's got to think about what's in it for your champion from a sort of time perspective, from a money perspective, and from a status perspective. And typically, most champions will be at this end, particularly sort of status orientated as well. So a lot of the time it'll be about a promotion, growing their career potential, growing their authority within the organization. I use this example a lot, but I've seen a lot of CIOs championing cloud migrations or large ERP implementations because they want that on their CV. They want to be able to say they've done that. So when they go to the next role or, look for moves internally from like a CIO to a COO type role, which I've seen happen as well, they want to be able to say they've done these big projects, they've done these complex projects and have that in their bag. So be thinking about what's the motivating factor for where do we get to? Yeah, motivating factor. Sorry. I say I'll edit that out, but I probably won't because I'm not very good at editing. So if this is still in, you're seeing behind the curtain. Like I'm not a great editor of videos, and it tends to kind of be a little beyond me to find moments like this. Anyway, shut up, Gavin. Move on. So they need to be motivated, and they need to be able to sell the idea internally. So I talked about having influence. They need that that gravitas, that respect, whatever you want to call it, that means that people will listen to their opinion and they can kind of get things done and they can exert influence over others. But they also need the ability to articulate the story, if you like, that you're articulating to them, the benefits, the challenge they're in at the moment, the cost of inaction, and then the benefit of making that change and the value they'll realize by doing that. So they need to be able to do that, and that might require coaching from you. It might require you to be able to provide them with a set of slides, a business case, a talk track, whatever it might be, but to help them out. And recently I did this with a client. I did a Loom video. As you can tell from this recording, I use Loom a lot. And when I sent a proposal over, I did a Loom talk track for it. And my champion was like, that's really great. I want to be able to say that the way you said it when I talked through this with the board. Can you help me to do that? And, with something like Loom is great. You can grab the text, turn it into a talk track for them. But the point being, he wanted to be able to tell the story in the same way that I did, and he was coachable and amenable to that. He identified that he had to do some internal selling and wanted to pick that up as well. So when you're thinking about a champion, you want to make sure you've got, they score high on all four of these. When you see somebody who maybe is motivated and can sell internally, but doesn't necessarily have kind of influence or authority, you're probably thinking like that's more like a coach, or maybe even just a fan, just someone who likes what you're selling, would like to implement that, thinks it'd be good. So if they're scoring high over here, but actually low or medium down here, you're probably not a champion status. And then coaches aren't bad, right? They can fill you in on lots of information. They can help you find champions. They can help you navigate the political environment within the organization, the kinds of people to avoid, or the kinds of people that will be tricky that you need to pay extra kind of focus or attention on. So they can give you lots of insight, but if they haven't got that authority and influence piece, it's going to be difficult to get your solution onto the kind of senior leadership radar, the board meeting, the senior leadership team meeting, whatever it might be. And then you've got somebody who, is motivated, but can't really sell internally, hasn't got a lot of influence, hasn't got a lot of authority. Then you're probably just talking to a fan, somebody who likes the product, but and again, they can be quite helpful in terms of guiding you, understanding where you're trying to get to and so on. But just because someone's excited, just because someone's talking to you, doesn't necessarily mean that they're a coach. The other thing to watch out for, and we touched on this earlier, is this confusion sometimes around the technical buyer. So technical buyers, they'll ask a lot of questions because they're looking for specific answers around things. And you'll probably get to engage with them quite a bit because they'll want to know this, they'll want to know that. So there'll be that back and forth flow. And they do have influence. Their opinion is important to the decision makers within the organization. But fundamentally, they don't necessarily have motivation, they don't necessarily have skin in the game. A lot of the time, like a technical buyer will see a project. We'll see a purchasing decision, implementing a new service, product, whatever, as a project, as work, right? Something that they're going to have to do, and particularly if I use the example of like an ERP migration or a cloud migration or something like that, they're probably sitting there thinking that's weekends when I've got to be on call to move data from, on-prem servers into the cloud. That's failing forward and failing back. That's trying to work through the complexities of the security architecture to make sure that we're happy that it's all covered. So it's these individuals, these guys and girls are they're going to have to do a bunch of work post sale. So depending on how they feel about it will depend, will make a difference to kind of where they're leaning and what they say. But getting them excited about it, getting them interested in it is not a bad thing to do. It's good, but it's not the same as having a champion. So I suppose to try and put a bow on that bit, don't get confused. Don't confuse a technical buyer who's asking lots of questions about your product and service because they need to know them to understand how they'd implement it or how it would look in real life with like an actual champion who has the authority, influence, motivation, and so on. You absolutely need to manage those technical buyers, but they are not. They're not your champions. So like we said, identify the champions, if possible, plural, especially mid-market or above, and you're looking for that aims piece. And sometimes I refer to it as skin in the game, and sometimes I refer to it as the ability to sell internally. But I think what you're really looking for here is, it's authority, it's influence, it's motivation, and skin in the game. That this is this idea of personal credibility on the line for this purchase, and don't confuse a coach with a champion. So skin in the game, I'm going to add, while we're doing this, plus ability to sell internally. And then let's just correct my spelling mistake. So why, obviously, you want influential, well thought after, dynamic people to help carry your deal from an idea through to completion. The book, The Challenger Customer, is a great book on this. I think The Challenger Customer is a better book for frontline sellers because a lot of what's covered in the Challenger sale, there's a real heavy bit on content marketing. So it's about marketing individuals, producing thought leadership, and that's been done to death in the last 10, 15 years. But read The Challenger Customer because it really highlights the kinds of individuals and the kinds of behaviors and attributes they have that will help take a deal or take an opportunity, if you like, from their perspective, to solve a problem and kind of really drive it and run with it. And it also kind of highlights some of the pitfalls and the mistakes, the errors that they sometimes make, or the foibles of engaging with somebody with that kind of like sort of typical kind of personality makeup, and the kind of things you need to like do to counter that. When to find a champion? Right, as early as possible. in smaller deals, the first person you speak to may well end up being your champion, if it's a small business. I would suggest that if you're talking to larger businesses, the first person you speak to probably won't be the champion. And like quite early on, it's a good idea to try and find the champion. So, how do you do that? This is where your kind of relationship building skills, really kick in. It's good to have an idea, just from monitoring and listening on LinkedIn and so on and so forth as to who might be the champion, what their motivators might be, and how you might support them. Ask the question, to the people you're speaking to. You might even want to say and be as direct as, who's somebody who has got influence or authority, who would benefit from this and could potentially drive this opportunity through. Or you could flip it around, like, which senior leader would this be most impactful for, and how do we get them involved, engaged, in front of how do we get in front of them to position this with them. A bit about motivators. Yeah, I touched on that a minute ago, right, with the what's in it for me matrix. It's really about thinking, what are they going to get out of it, how are they going to benefit from it, and playing to that. And then, you want to spend time with them. You want to build good relationships with them. If you can build that that camaraderie, that kind of we're in it together kind of approach with them, and there's a kind of like we need to get this done. Then it's almost a good time to start talking about like mutual action plans. So, is it ever too early to start talking about a mutual close plan, or a kind of, I tend to call them like a go live plan, because really they're not about getting a deal closed. They're about going live with a product or solution and realizing value. So there's start to talk around that with your coach, with your champion, sorry, as early as possible in the buying process. And it's just a good idea, a good way of identifying the steps you're going to have to go through, the individuals you're going to have to navigate, how your champion can help. So it's like, it's a mutual plan, right? So how are they going to help? What are they going to do? What can they do to support this getting through? But also it kind of helps you see what gaps you've got, and if you need to recruit another champion. And a good way of recruiting a second or third champion oftentimes is to ask your actual, your first champion, who else could support this? Who else would be a dynamic force for getting this over the line, to support us? So champions, really important. Easily kind of misunderstood sometimes. I think just because someone wants to talk to you, just because they're excited about your product or service, doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to be a great champion. And you want to spend some time just checking that they are actually a champion before you kind of say, right, this is the individual, they're going to help us get this over the line. So now we come on to the economic buyer. And the interesting thing about the economic buyer is a lot of time as sort of salespeople or sales leader, we'll chase around sellers trying to say, oh, have you met the economic buyer? You want to get in front of them, etc., etc. A lot of the time you'll find that you don't get in front of the economic buyer. You just don't. Sometimes it's tempting to feel like they are the individual who owns the problem and has the budget. And you think, okay, well, so-and-so has the budget, so they're the economic buyer. That's not always the case. In fact, I'd say it's rarely the case. Even if someone has a budget, often they still need to go to some kind of finance function to get approval. Kind of a case in point, deal I was working on, kind of a low seven-figure deal, a couple of years back, and the CTO had the budget, had the authority, had the remit to make the changes to their data platform that they needed to do to become a much more kind of data-centric, agile business, whatever you want to call it. And he'd been through a number of processes with this guy, and he was kind of at the point where, like, right, okay, I like what you're offering. We pulled a statement of work together. It was like, okay, we'll get that across, we'll get that signed, and kind of off we go. Anyway, fast forward, and I was, getting happy ears and assuming that, great, okay, we can get this all signed off. And he'll be like, it'll take a couple of weeks and, be done. Lo and behold, as he dug into the process he needed to go through to get anything signed off that was over $99,000, pounds, dollars, euros, something like that. Anyway, as soon as it hit that six-figure mark, that 100K mark, there was a completely different sign-off process. And the headquarters were in Paris. These guys obviously based in the UK. Where I was talking to them, he had to go through a elongated kind of buying. What's the best way of kind of putting it? Like he was almost on trial, right? You had to present a business case. The business case had to be iterated 2 or 3 times. You had to get certain individuals on board with it. So while on paper he had a budget, he had some internal selling to do within this almost like a group of economic buyers so they could get to the purchasing committee and that they would sign it off. And he was never in doubt that he would get it through. I was a little bit because he just kept underestimating how long this was going to take. And it did come off in the end, but it took about 8 weeks. So my deal slipped to almost 3 months. When you think about it from a calendar month perspective, it slipped almost 3 months back. And, all the feedback I was getting was, yeah, look, going through the process, we're going to get it done. And I was sort of shouting up the line to my sales directors, look, this is what's going on. And, I got that typical pushback. It's like, we need to get on for the economic buy. I need to understand where they're at. So I was like, I explained to this guy, it's not going to happen. They're based out of Paris. They have a kind of process that they go through because they're a large organization. And I, even brought my boss in to meet with the CTO, who was, I suppose, effectively the champion as well as the problem owner. And, it was really clear. It's not a, salesperson or sales leader gets in front of an economic buyer and makes all the pain go away. These individuals, these organizations with those kind of tight controls on finances have processes that you need to adhere to and manage through. And as early as possible in the sort of solution exploration phase, when we know we've got an opportunity that we can work with, we need to start to understand, okay, what is involved in that decision process and who are the economic buyer? And that's where, we talked a little bit earlier about asking somebody when they've bought a solution like this before, getting them to explain the steps they've been through. That's why that question is so important, because you get a feel for, right, this is the kind of thing that you have to do to get it through. And ultimately there were a couple of economic buyers in this kind of situation. We were never going to get to them. But had I done that work earlier on, I'd have had a lot easier time internally, because I'd have been able to say, look, this is the way they sign things off, and this is the way it happens, and we're going to have to just trust and support our champion, empower them to do the right thing. In smaller organizations, obviously it's a bit different. Roles gets compressed more often. If you're dealing with particularly like an SMB, 20, 50, 100 employee business, typically you'll find it's the MD, the CFO, or the CEO, depending on kind of how they structure things. They'll be kind of easy to identify. But once even then, you want to understand the size of the purchase, and what does that size of purchase then mean from a decision approval perspective. Another opportunity I've been working on recently, the economic buyer was sat on the board, I think they call it the senior leadership team, the SLT, and he was just an individual I wasn't going to get to speak to. He was the chief commercial officer, but he had delegated this to the chief growth officer, and the chief growth officer was empowered to go out and make the decision. But then in terms of actually the money, he had to go back and then put a business case through for getting this money to spend it in 2025. So how do we do this? You need to do some kind of triangulation. So it's worth asking a couple of different people within an opportunity about the economic buyer, who releases the funds, and kind of questions sometimes like, if you've got someone who's got a budget and they say, oh no, it's my decision, I've got a budget, I'll sign off. It's like, oh, that's great, okay. Typically when I work with companies whose CIO has a budget, sometimes they need co-signature from somebody in finance. Is that the case in your situation? Or you could say they have a finance business partner, um, um, or kind of other soft ways of saying it. Lots of organizations these days run everything past their CFO or VP of finance. Do you guys do that? What kind of spend levels and so on? So asking those kind of questions to try and filter out exactly what the values are, at which point something gets a greater degree of scrutiny. Because, like in this opportunity I was telling you about a minute ago, the CTO actually said to me, he said, Gavin, you might as well have sent me, like 11, 12 orders of 99 grand, because I'd have been able to sign those off pretty quickly. But as soon as it went above 100 grand, kind of, I was done. Yeah, and also from an economic buyer perspective, it's that, is it finance, is it procurement, who approves purchase orders as well? That's the kind of other key thing. So if you're working with an organization, and they run on POs, as many organizations do, you'll often find you can't, somebody won't sign a document unless they've got a PO to back it off against. And the raising of that PO might be the most painful part of the whole sale. You might have somebody sitting ready to sign a piece of paper, but because they have a difficult system for getting POs approved and out into the world, that might become an issue as well. So when you're thinking about economic buyers, don't just think, who holds the budget. Think, okay, you might have a budget for it, but who do you have to? It's like this is a really bad example, but like it's like when your child has pocket money, they might still have whatever, they might get £20 a month, £50 a month pocket money, but if they're going to spend, if they want to spend that, if they want to get that money to spend, they have to come and ask the parents for it. And if they want to make a big want to spend all the pocket money at once on something online, they'll be like, oh, mum, dad. So yeah, obviously don't try and use that analogy with your customers, but that is the kind of dynamic. Yeah, I can't stress this enough. The difference between making a decision and approving spend is not the same thing. Hopefully, more often than not, you'll find it is. But in my experience, particularly in enterprise, you need to think very clearly that they are going to be two different individuals, maybe even three or four different individuals. You might have a couple of different financial guardians that you need to kind of work through. But the sooner you ask, the sooner you explore how they make decisions and how they sign off against work, the quicker you'll get an answer, and the quicker you'll be able to kind of sort of figure out, okay, the economic buyer, this is the person I need to keep an eye on. When I'm on holiday, what's important to them? What do they like to see in a cover sheet before they sign something off, etc., etc. So then, just touching again on those kind of questions, the kind of questions you can use to out the economic buyer, who will ultimately sign off on any purchasing decision you make, if not in finance. Would anyone from finance need to approve or rubber stamp that spend? So that's quite a good phrase, actually, if you're speaking to somebody like a COO or a CRO or something. It's like, it's your budget, but would anyone need to rubber stamp it? So that's saying, we know you've got the authority, but would someone need to kind of actually physically trigger the release of money? And then it's like, what's going to be important when going through the approval process with this? So really understanding what you need to have lined up for them to be comfortable. So we're going to take a deep dive into decision criteria now that we've kind of covered off the economic buyer. And I know I touched on it a little bit earlier on, but the decision criteria is a really critical part of kind of managing the opportunity. Understanding how a organization is going to make a buying decision, the factors that they're going to look at when making that final call, that's really important, because that helps you then set up everything you do afterwards in terms of demos, in terms of proposals, in terms of the conversations that you have as you're getting maybe down selected close to final selection. And there's a tool here that I used. I can't remember who I stole it from, but like most of the things in here, it's been acquired over many years, which is really about like ranking your decision criteria and then comparing them against your competitors. So you're going to find the old favorites pop up, like price, payment terms. There'll be some kind of commercial terms that might, maybe I don't know, liability is always a big one, kind of particularly if you're working with larger organizations. Smaller organizations tend not to worry too much about liability because, like, if uh, if a business, if a company takes you to court, and you're nowhere near capitalized, you're just gonna, it's like, we'll just go bust and you won't get any of the money. Whereas if you're a more stable, larger organization, then they might actually have to pay it. Geography, so you co-located, you're in the same kind of trading district. Sometimes that's important, sometimes not. But I mean, depending on what you sell, whether it's software, whether it's professional services, whether it's hardware, they're going to be different criteria that will be important to your client, and you'll know instinctively, you'll have an idea as to where you're strong. So, in this example, I've kind of just suggested that you're strong from an SLA perspective, from a balance of trade perspective, payment terms. You'll have a feel of where you're strong. I will come back to balance of trade, by the way. You have a feeling of where you're strong, and you'll want to kind of lead customers towards seeing the value in those, because as a business, you or your product manager or your CEO or founder, they've invested money, effort, and time in getting certain aspects of the product or service really strong because they believe they're important to the marketplace. So you'll know, right, we're really strong at this because we believe it's important in the marketplace, whereas we're less strong on that because we see it as less of an important factor to our clients. So a lot of the time, these things will have some logic behind them. Often, sometimes they don't, or particularly if you're getting to a new market, it's not necessarily clear, and maybe the application, the software is kind of early. You might not do, but hopefully, you'll have an idea where you're strong. You'll have an idea of the story behind why you've invested in there and where you're weak. You are weak, and hopefully it's a defensible position. The next challenge is really to understand what's important to your customer. So, what does your customer value when making a decision? What are the kind of things that they're going to be looking at? Now, price always comes in. So it's always like, oh, it's got to be within budget, or it's got to be competitively priced, etc., etc. But then it's about understanding, okay, great. What about features? What about payment terms? What about the nature of the delivery of the service, and so on and so forth? So pulling those criteria out from your customer during that back end of the discovery phase, you're working towards some kind of proposal or some kind of demo, getting a feel for that. Now, the other thing to remember is, and I kind of touched on this a couple of times through the video, maybe more than a couple of times, is it's not just one person's opinion. There isn't just like a set number of decision criteria that everybody within organization XYZ that you're selling to is going to adhere to, that's going to be important to them. There's going to be a range. Some individuals will see some things as being more important and some as less. And often that will come back to their own wants, needs, goals, and biases. So somebody in finance might be really keen on 90-day payment terms and really cheap pricing extended over a long period of time, etc., etc., very favorable commercial terms. Somebody from a technical perspective might be all about the features. So it might be, what does a product or solution do? How does it fit for what we're currently doing? Is it written in, I don't know, Python or whatever? Is it available on AWS and Google and Azure? Is it available on the cloud platforms, whatever it might be? So different individuals will have slightly different takes on this, and you'll get that kind of Venn diagram effect where you've got 80% probably of the decision criteria everyone will have somewhere in there, but 20% of them will be more important to one person than another. Your job is to fish these out. Your job is to try and rank them in terms of what's important to the client. And then once you've done that, and we'll touch on the how in a second, but once you've done that, don't assume that they recognize where you're strong. Don't assume that, because you've got, I don't know, fantastic service level agreements that they get that and they understand that. Make sure that you ask the question, okay, so these things are important to you. Currently, how do you perceive um, us? How do you perceive what we're selling against that set of criteria? Because that'll give you your first view. And once you've got that, it's about how do you, where you are strong and it's not important to them, how do you emphasize that? Where you are weak and it's important to them, how do you minimize that? Or how do you kind of try and take that out of the equation? That then becomes the challenge for you as the seller. Now, if we jump back into, let's go to use guide, decision criteria. So this is pretty straightforward. You want to ask open, direct questions of stakeholders, and you want to ask them more than once, because that's the other thing that I keep repeating, is this isn't static. If your opportunity lasts, it takes 90 days for a piece of business to close, one thing is bound to change. Something will change in 90 days. It won't stay completely static, and if it does, you're very lucky. Maybe 30 days, 45 days, you might be okay. You might get away with it. Might not be a lot of change, but once you get into that, once you get close to a quarter, things will change, particularly if the quarterly performance has been notable, either notably bad, in which case, they might prioritize other things, or notably good, in which case, again, they might be double downing on other areas, but double downing, is that a word? Don't assume things change. You want to clarify the criteria and kind of keep checking, say, look, is this still the case? Are these still the ones important to you? Has anything else been added to it? I made a mistake recently in not rechecking one of the decision criteria for a client. I was trying to get over the line and I missed something and it ended up costing me, and I've been kicking myself about it. But yes, don't assume things don't change. Ask little and often. It's that kind of little and often, grease the groove kind of approach around the buying criteria, and just checking they're still important, nothing else has been added, what's changed, and so on. And then ask comparison questions to try and get that ranking. So if they're talking about price and SLAs, it's like, all things being equal, at what point does reducing the SLAs to reduce the price start to become a problem? For example, or security is another great one. Obviously you want this thing to be delivered quickly and cost effectively, but at what point does, we can take security features out, we can cut corners, blah blah, I don't know, but at what point does that start to become more painful than just paying a bit more money or going a bit slower, etc., etc. So comparison questions, ask questions for clarity, and do it across the stakeholder group to build consensus, because you really want to know, when you're thinking about your different kind of types of users, the end user, the line manager, the executive technical buyers, you want to know what their kind of decision-making criteria are, and that you've got a few different views and you're covered. So just to reinforce this point, and I use this image and this analogy a lot when I'm coaching and training, is the parable of the blind man and the elephant. So, what you have in organizations is a number of different people looking at the same problem, but from different perspectives, and they see kind of different things. So they have a different view on what the problem is, and therefore what the decision criteria, what's important when making a purchasing decision to them, is going to be. And your job really is, and this is coming back to putting the customer at the center of what you're doing, is to help them navigate this buying situation, to help bring them together, to see that, yes, it might look like, the elephant might look like a wall here or a rope over here, but actually when you stand back and you put these things together, this is what it looks like in totality. And then you can start to make choices around how we make this decision based on a full picture rather than just a small part of what we're doing. And each, when you think about these different people, everyone, and we all do this, right, in our organizations, we get really hyper focused on our role, our bit of the job, the thing we do day in, day out. And unless you're a seasoned exec or somebody on the climb, you tend not to have that bigger picture view. So that's where, as a seller, you have the opportunity. Oh, there you go. It's me searching for different images of the blind man. As a seller, you have an opportunity to help them all stand back and see, the bigger picture and actually what all the different bits are made of. So first of all, you've noticed I've changed. Like I said, this video is taking a while to record and it's going to take a while to edit, and I'm not that great in continuity, so apologies for that. We're going to focus on now is the decision-making process. So one of the things that's really important to understand is how an organization goes about making a decision. And we might find that they have a really structured process, a structured way of going through that, involving certain gates, involving certain individuals, depending on what the purchase is and so on. It might be that it's a really loose kind of agile approach. I could say agile, chaotic. Small organizations are just making decisions on the fly and trying to figure it out on the go. But you'll typically find there'll be some kind of meeting or sort of regular leadership meeting or group meeting that kind of important decisions get discussed, and then there'll be probably meetings that sit above that where money gets discussed. So it's about understanding how budget is acquired, their budgeting cycle, what hurdles and processes you have to go through, and then really importantly as well is what are the other things that they'll be deciding on at this meeting, and is your item close to the top of that list. So I remember recently going through a sales process, and the idea was to take the opportunity to the senior leadership team meeting in, I think it was November, and they timed out. So the plan was then they were going to have a special meeting between the November and December SLT meetings to kind of discuss this item and get it approved. And I heard that and I thought, that sounds great. But the cynic in me thought it's probably unlikely to materialise, and by the time they get around to finding a slot, they'll probably just tack it on to the next one. And lo and behold, yes, it happened at the December one, which is where the decision then got made and budget got acquired for this particular item. So understanding the set pieces, the kind of key meetings that organisations are going to have is a really important thing to do kind of as early as you can. One of the other questions to ask, and a lot of people talk about this and I really like it, is the question that is, when you've made a purchasing decision like this before, when you've bought a product or service like this before, what's been the process? What have been the stages? Who's been involved? So that kind of taking people back to the past to understand, the present and what's going to go through. And I think I've referenced this earlier in the video, but it's a really good way of understanding, the people I'm talking to, how well equipped are they to get me through this journey? How much visibility do we have to help move the sale through the buying journey and the buying process? So decision-making process is really important. The other sort of part about this, and I kind of touched on it in earlier on, is that as part of the decision-making process, who's the decision-making unit? If you're selling training like I do, are HR involved? Are sales enablement involved? Or is it just the sales leader and the financial control or whatever it might be? So understanding is different organizations are structured different ways, who your different kind of stakeholders are going to be is really important. And then the decision process, I suppose it's a really good time in this decision process to start to think about what happens next, like this idea of addressing concerns. So once you map out a decision process, you're at this kind of stage, you've got a real opportunity, you're talking through kind of next steps, maybe even starting to think about a mutual action plan, if there's that kind of level of engagement, showing some leadership by talking through what other customers have typically done when they're buying your product or service, the stages they've been through, whether it's a trial, a proof of concept, re-evaluation, or whatever it might be, some kind of presentation or workshop or assessment. Um, as you're kind of going through that, you've mapped out that decision process. This is the time when you want to start thinking about, right, okay, what are the blockers and barriers going to be to going from where you are now through to getting that document signed? And there's potentially a bunch of things, right? So first of all, there's the potential that uh, your competition does a better job than you and outsells you. Okay, so that's one thing to think about. But more often than not, these things tend to die on the vine because of no decision, because the momentum kind of gets lost, or it gets caught at a difficult kind of decision point, and there's never advances beyond that because the decision makers involved can't see the value or whatever it might be. So this is where this idea of addressing concerns, of building some confidence in a purchasing decision becomes really important. So you understand the decision making process, and then you kind of want to drill into, right, okay, so what could derail this? So first of all, when you're moving into this stage, you really want to think about coming back to pain, right? So, we started this conversation all the way back here, and that's because we'd identified a problem that you had. We've kind of quantified that to a certain extent using maybe industry metrics, maybe your metrics. Now it's kind of like checking out how is this still a big pain? Now we've been through this process. Are we still sure that this is a big enough pain to warrant action, to warrant moving forwards? Can we build metrics around it that will satisfy an economic buyer in a business case, or satisfy the business in a business case? So that decision process I talked about, where you typically, it might be like I was talking to somebody the other day, and he talked about his boardroom, and there's three of them, three of them, and they start in the office at about 2 o'clock, and they get to the pub by 5 o'clock, and then they continue it in the pub. So it was a very casual process, but in that environment, they still make budget allocation decisions. And unfortunately for me, in that case, they decided to push the work we were talking about doing out sort of 3 months because they're going to invest in something else. So potentially I didn't irritate the pain enough. I didn't kind of double down on the pain. So irritate the pain, so kind of tweaking it, checking it. So the kind of questions you want to be asking is, it's that kind of, imagine this, if you jump forward 6 months and this problem isn't solved, how's that going to feel? What's that going to look like? What will the knock-on effects be? If what are the business metrics that are going to really suffer if this isn't addressed, in the next kind of couple of months? When we're looking back at the end of the year, if you didn't solve this problem, what might that mean from a business performance perspective, from like your personal perspective, the team's perspective? You can ask it a bunch of different ways. Then, again, it's that building those business case metrics that will fly past an economic buyer. And this is where you're probably relying on your champion to a certain extent to help you with the economic buyer. If you can get in front of the economic buyer, that's great. And sometimes you'll be able to do that. But if you're in enterprise sales, that's often really, really challenging, because the economic buyer is going to be somebody in a financial position, probably, or maybe a board position. And they're not going to they're not going to be interested in having a meeting with a salesperson. They may not be even interested in having a meeting with an exec, although that might be, a good way, doing some of that peer-to-peer selling. If I can identify who the economic buyer is, you can say, oh, my CEO's keen to have a conversation with you. Can we set some time up? That kind of peer-to-peer piece can sometimes work quite well. But oftentimes, these individuals are just running through spreadsheets. And they're like, well, I'm not really busy, not really interested. And there are some people I know who actively avoid meeting suppliers when a decision is due, because they want to make a decision based on facts and figures rather than emotion. And they're worried if they like you, right? If you get to sell to them, they'll make a decision that maybe they wouldn't make otherwise. So economic buyers are tricky to get to. So this is where getting that pain identified and metrics built around it become really, really important. And remember that, the cost of inaction and the return on investment. So the two sides of that coin. So economic buyers, you know, if you come in with a really specific number, they'll probably kind of look at you quite slightly funny. But if you come in with a more rounded number, it'll be 15 to 20%, or even like 18 to 24%. That's probably that's not an obvious number, but it's a range. These individuals tend to think in ranges, so that's quite a good kind of psychological tip. But building out a business case that they'll recognise, that they'll understand, that shows, yes, return on investment, but also, what's it costing you now by not changing that kind of situation. And then in terms of the decision-making process, who's involved? Who's in that decision-making unit? So yeah, you'll have the economic buyer. Is your champion involved in that as well? Are they going to have a direct say, or do they kind of sit on the outside? Is there, is the CEO involved, some kind of business unit leader? They may have individuals from kind of low down in management as kind of, I suppose, advocates or subject matter experts or technical buyers that they want to kind of run through. So again, these two kind of things go hand in hand. What's the process and kind of who's involved? Does your champion get involved? Can you get access to the economic buyer? But thinking about those four things when you come, to the end or, mid-end of your kind of selling process become really critical, because really what you want to be doing is heightening the pain to continue to create urgency, and alleviating risk around making the decision by talking through what you could do were things to go wrong, by building out a mutual action plan that shows what you're going to do and what they're going to need to do. I mean, a lot of the time, when clients or companies or customers buy something from you, they're the biggest reason they don't see the full value, because either they haven't rolled it out properly, or they haven't, made sure everyone's using it correctly, or, they wait before rolling out after making a kind of spending decision, or because they haven't fully assessed their own situation, and it means that what you're trying to help them with wasn't, they've made some assumptions, or there were some other reasons why they couldn't get it done the way they expected to. And that's where mutual action plans can be really helpful, because it highlights these are the things you're going to need to do to get it done. So, like if I think about some kind of cloud migration, which is something we've done a lot of, that whole idea of, a lot of times you're going to see dual running, so there's sort of double cost there. And it is how quickly can you get, one thing migrated into, say in Azure, how quickly can you get one thing migrated into Azure, check it, and then turn down what's on premise, because the longer those two run, the more you're going to have kind of double spend. And a lot of that will require the customer to do some kind of tests, run some kind of failover, etc., etc. So it becomes really like a burden, like a work on them. And if you remember when I talked about the technical buyer earlier on, this idea that the technical buyers will often see some of these the outcomes of some of these sales as just kind of work for them. So it's about identifying, what's involved, what's the customer going to have to do, how can we make that kind of simple for it, how can we address that risk with everyone involved in that decision-making unit. The other thing, in terms of an economic buyer, if they're looking to see some kind of saving or some kind of uptick, it's going to be, right, well, how quickly am I going to see that value delivered, so that I can look at this from a financial perspective and check that I'm happy with it. And a lot of that will rely on the client. So if you're rolling out a new CRM system, a lot of it's going to be how quickly we migrate, right? Because you might start paying for your pipe drive licenses, for example, on the first of the month, but if you don't start migrating stuff until the 31st of the month, 3 months later on, you've wasted a quarter's worth of spend. So, understanding that kind of level of minutiae is important, particularly to address, some concerns that will crop up. So thinking through decision-making process and so on, it's worth having a look at our little user guide here. So, how is a buying decision going to be made for this type of purchase? And like I said, your role here really is to help the client make a really good decision. Clients aren't often sure how the process will work. They might have some idea, but often, this is a really good point, actually. about enterprise sales. So oftentimes, and I've dealt with this numerous times, where you're selling to somebody and they know they have the authority, they know they can get the budget, but what the actual process then looks like, they have no idea, or they are unsure of. And that might be because they've never done it a particular way. It might be because it's changed. It might be because they merged with another business. It might be because they're relatively new into the role. But it comes up more often than you expect. And people actually, they know in theory they can buy something, and they've got the kind of authority to do it on paper, but actually in practice, how they then get that authority signed off so that a PO can be released or whatever, becomes a challenge for them to kind of figure out. So I'd ask the question at the back end of a discovery call as like a test balloon. I'm going to do what I do there as a test balloon. So you want to get that kind of question in the back of their mind. So they're thinking about, all right, how am I going to get this over the line if it's something I want to go ahead with, it's something I want to buy. But then if you haven't tested at the end of the discovery, you want to start talking about it, the demo. And the demos are good, whether it's demo or presentation or whatever it might be. But that part, that like your second meeting, your second stage, is a really good opportunity to start to, use examples of how other organizations have done it. And I've touched on this a number of times, but it's that, typically customers do this. Typically, at this stage in the decision-making process, a customer or a prospect will do these three things to get the sale moving, or to get a proof of concept up and running, whatever it might be. So using that phrase typically to kind of show some leadership, to signpost the way that you would expect it to go, is really good. And then you can start to draw out from that whether the process that you kind of articulate based on what you've seen elsewhere is going to be real for them, or if there are going to be additional stages or less stages, or more complex or less complex. But by giving them something they can compare with, an example of how it's happened in the past, it takes the mental load off, right? So they don't have to sit there and think, oh God, all right, so I've got to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. They can just look at what you've given them, what you've suggested to them, and they can go, oh yeah, no, we do those two things there. That one not so much. That one not so much. We do it slightly differently, and so on. So it makes their mental load much easier. So when you're asking some of these questions, you actually get to an answer quicker. So decision making, we've touched on metrics, iterate, pain, economic buy. So this is a really good time now to start to think about the paper process. So let's assume that the decision making unit has been satisfied, the economic buyer has been satisfied, and you kind of all guns blazing. The supplier selection stage, the paper process, this is where I've seen more deals go wrong than I can count. And they're in the bag at that stage. You put them to 95% in Salesforce, you've spent half the commission in the back of your mind, and then the lawyers get involved, and the commercial finance team gets involved, and so on and so forth. So from a very simple perspective, the idea of the paper process is visualize. Imagine days before DocuSign. Visualize the route that the piece of the order form, pardon me, the order form or the terms and conditions, the master services agreement, whatever it might be. Imagine the path that document takes from when it leaves your hands to getting to the final person that's going to sign it. And that might be your customer, might also be someone in your organization, because I've only worked in an organization like this once, but before you could book it, the customer had to sign it, and then we had to countersign it. And I remember once the guy who was going to countersign, there'd been some movement, some leadership changes, and the guy who was due to countersign on our side was away on holiday, and he just point blank refused to log on while he was away to sign it, and we had to twist his arm and so on. And one of his big hang-ups, and this is an interesting story, is the customer wanted to use their paper, which was a bit annoying, but like that happens. and they wanted to send it from their DocuSign because it was just easier for them to approve that way. So it doesn't sound like a big deal, right? But the problem being, our organisation, the organisation I was working for at the time, was paranoid about changes being made between us agreeing the document in Word and then pushing it through DocuSign and just signing it blindly. So what happened was we got this kind of document agreed, and then the customer was going to sign it, and send it to us then to countersign. And because of that, and because they were sending it to us, this guy, he wanted it proofread, but he didn't take his, like, he had his phone basically, right? And he was going to DocuSign it on his phone. And he was like, I can't see it with both documents, and go through it and check they haven't made changes. Da, 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 da. So, like, I don't know whether you call that like not a lot of trust in your customers, or whether you just call that being really diligent, maybe somewhere in between. But either way, we had to go through the document when it came through DocuSign with the original and satisfy this guy that they hadn't made any changes. And of course they hadn't, right? They're not trying to sneak one over on us, but they hadn't made any changes. And we got it across to him. And even then, it took 2 or 3 days for him to sign the damn thing off. But I tell that story to highlight how ridiculous sometimes getting these documents signed can be. So going into that level of detail, understanding that process is really important. I'll give you another example. I managed IBM as an account for many, many years, and they had a very particular sign-off process for some of their procurement, and it would happen every other Wednesday. So, if you missed it, if you were trying to get something done on a Wednesday afternoon, you might have to wait 2 weeks before that's even reviewed by this committee. It had to be submitted through a certain system, and you had to have certain checks and competitive quotes and so on in place. And because I knew IBM so well and I worked really well to understand their processes, I knew that process better than any of the people I dealt with or sold to. So when we would have a conversation and they would say, I need this in place by this date, I would say, well, in that case, like, this is our lead time to set it up, but you have these dates that you need to be aware of. So you need to, you need to submit it on a Monday by 5 p.m. so that it can be reviewed on the Wednesday. And if you miss that, you have to wait, 10 days. And when you do submit it, if you don't have this level of information, then it will be kicked back. So I can go on and on about that process for a long time, but fundamentally, there are a number of different ways deals can go and die during the paper process, or at the very least, just be delayed incredibly. So getting that level of understanding is really important. The other piece around this is around terms, commercial terms. So terms and conditions, and particularly master services agreements, and a lot of enterprise deals can be critical. If you're going into an opportunity and you don't have like a master services agreement in place, if you're not already on their supplier system or things like that, it can be incredibly difficult. So, and also then if on your side, if your organization is quite hot on these things and can be quite, difficult or challenging, you need to factor that into your deal. So all the way through the process, you need to be bearing in mind that you've got a difficult commercial conversation potentially to have, and you've got some things you might need to go through. And the sooner you can start to address that, the better. So as soon as you get to a point where there's a fair chance you might win the business, and there's a fair chance that whether you win that deal or not, they're going to want to do business with you in different ways over the coming months and years. Start talking about getting those kind of terms and conditions in place. Start looking through them. I remember trying to sell to BP, I think it was. Yeah, BP. And we did a really good account sort of sales job. We got in the room where maybe we shouldn't have. We started to have some really interesting conversations with some of their key people. We flew out to Houston to spend time with them in their offices. And then that was the point when, the procurement guy kind of sat me down and said, we'd assumed that we had terms and conditions in place, but it appears like we don't. So um, we need to get those in place kind of pretty damn quick. And ultimately, long story short, on that one, we started to the product or service we were selling started to kind of, I didn't stand up well against other organizations because it wasn't our core offering. Our core offering was something else, but it was a great Trojan horse to potentially get into BP. But they wanted to put the terms and conditions in place for this particular thing, and as that particular sale lost momentum, it became more and more difficult to get the terms and conditions resolved, and we dragged our feet, and we were really bad. And it's one of the big learnings I made. We're really bad about getting those terms and conditions in place. And so by the time that kind of Trojan horse opportunity had failed, we were in a situation where we had the conversation, and I was like, well, look, this is our core business, and we can really help you there. And they're like, yeah, you can, but we've got others that do that as well, and you guys aren't on our terms and conditions. So it's just a lot easier to do that. So never underestimate the importance of having those terms and conditions in place. Never underestimate the power of a frictionless buying experience. I've had the same experience with other organizations, large financial institutions, where trying to get agreement on terms has just meant that it's easier for them to go elsewhere and take maybe an inferior product, but they'll be able to implement it quickly because it's with an existing supplier. So terms and conditions, the paper process, these kind of aspects. And the reason I clump them all in together is because they can have a real impact on, the decision process and the decision criteria. This whole thing about getting over the line is fraught with difficulty. So don't sleep on the paper process. Do not sleep on the paper process. So this final bit, solution ownership, is the bit that often gets forgotten about. So like I said in the outset, one of the issues I have with MEDDPICC is when you see it, oftentimes it's just from the seller's perspective, and I like to try and start everything from like a buyer's point of view. So what's the buyer's business goal? What are they trying to achieve? How do we help them? And this part here, the solution ownership phase, is really when the promise that we made during the sale of value, of delivering value, should be realized. So I know it doesn't begin with an I, but eliminate pain. So you should revisit and check that the problem has been reduced, if not solved, and then measure that. So can we see through metrics that the value is being realized? Are the decision-making unit happy that the value is being realized? Can they see that? Does our champion feel like they got a good deal, a good outcome? Are they still a champion? So this piece is really, really important, particularly because this is the bit that the customer cares about. They're not that fussed. This is painful for them to a certain extent. Yeah, they might get excited and so on, but it's this bit, it's the ownership bit that they are excited about, that they are looking for. And when we've made a sale, it's important to go back and check, that this is going on, and whether you do it directly, which is what I would advise, or whether you speak to, if someone's picked up from an account management perspective or customer success, whatever it might be, but you want to go back and check that actually the what you thought would happen has happened, that you've delivered on that value. And this is also really important, not just because it's the right thing to do, but also because when you're building that mutual action plan, that kind of go live document, you shouldn't be ending it after they sign the deal. It shouldn't just suddenly stop, right? They've signed the deal and the action plan's over. No, it needs to be, there needs to include some kind of implementation plan. There needs to include some kind of, review period. There needs to include some kind of, whether it's hypercare or whatever it might be. But it needs to be tailored to make sure that that post-signature process and feeling feels like the customer got the result, that they've had the pain alleviated, they feel different as a result of this interaction. So without kind of going into lots and lots of detail in each of these, because we've done this already, it becomes really important to build this into your plan, your mutual action plan, kind of when you're at this stage of the process, at that kind of solution exploration, moving into addressing concern stage, and you build out your go live plan, your mutual action plan. Include this bit. Don't just DocuSign done, see you later, I'm out of here. That's not cool. That's not a good way to build long-term customer value. That's not a good way to get referrals, for example. So build that into your mutual action plan. Check that the metrics stack up. It's unlikely to be exactly the same, but you want to kind of check that they are broadly there or thereabouts. Check that the key people in the decision-making unit are happy. Check the champions are happy, and then ask for a referral. Ask if there's anything else that you can do for them, or if you've got a really good view of that account, tell them what you might be able to do with them, because a lot of the time, particularly in first sales, you want them to be land and expand. And then, do they know anybody else in any other organizations that might be suffering from the same? Absolutely no harm in asking that question. And referrals go such a long way. I know, running a small business, most of my business comes off the back of referrals, because that's where trust is built the quickest. So really important, often overlooked part of MEDDPICC is that post-sale analysis of the delivery of value.